When pioneers moved to the west with courage strong, they met the test. They pushed their handcarts all day long, and as they pushed they sang this song. For some must push and some must pull as we go marching up the hill. So merrily on the way we go until we reach the valley. Oh.
Always kind of overwhelming to see people come to Wyoming. You know, we've never had anything that anybody wanted to come see. I've lived here all my life, and you know, they see I-80 and that's all they want to see of Wyoming. And some venture as far as Yellowstone and the Tetons, but Central Wyoming has never had anything of any interest to anybody. And to have all the people that have come is a very humbling thing for us. We didn't intend for this to happen. We didn't seek for this to happen. It just happened. This stake, the Riverton, Wyoming stake, is the borders of it are Fremont County. It's one of the largest stakes in the church. It takes about 4 hours to drive across it. There are only about 30,000 people in our stake, of which we represent about 10 to 12% of the population. I grew up in Casper, Wyoming, which is just 120 miles from here, and because of growing up there and being close to Independence Rock and Martin's Cove, learned about the Handcart people. It really all started for me some of these things are kind of hard to talk about. So if I get a little emotional, just stay with me, because it's just the way I am. I was 6 years old in a primary class, and we had a teacher by the name of Rhea White, and she could tell primary stories, or pioneer stories, so well. I believed that she was with them. I just knew that Sister White was part of the Martin Handcart Company because she told them with such feeling. One day she brought a picture to primary class. One of the pictures is of a family in Martin's Cove. You can tell by the picture that the man who painted it had never been to Martin's Cove, which wasn't that unusual because at that time nobody got into Martin's Cove. There's trees and large trees and hills and things that don't exist in Martin's Cove. But there's a painting that's there, and she showed us the painting, and tomorrow in the visitor center over at the Sun Ranch you'll see the picture. There's a man leaning up against the wheel of a handcart with one arm around his wife and another arm around one of his children. And there's a small boy standing there in the snow looking at them. Sister White told us that the man had just died, and that's why the wife and the child were crying, because he would have to be buried and they would have to pull the handcart. For some reason that picture just got a hold of me, and I couldn't stop staring at it. Sister White noticed that I was staring at it, and she said, "Scotty, what are you looking at?" And I said, "I'm looking at that little boy." And she said, "Well, what do you think he's looking at?" And I said, "He's looking at that man's boots." And then she asked me probably the hardest question I've ever been asked. She said, "If you were that little boy, would you take that man's boots?" 6 years old, that's a tough question. Been taught not to steal, been taught to be kind. Would I take that man's boots? I said, finally, after a pause that seemed like forever, I said, "Yes, Sister White, I would take his boots." And that was my introduction to the Martin Handcart Company. She said, "That's right. The man would want you to take the boots." She showed us in the picture that there was still wear left in the boots. She said he didn't need them anymore, and he would want someone else to have them so that they could wear them all the way to Salt Lake and keep their feet warm. That impression never left me. Years later, after studying the history of the church, after having served a mission, completed my undergraduate at Brigham Young University, I found myself attending University of Nebraska for a master's degree. I was called to be the Elders Quorum president, and one of our assignments was to go and clean the graves at winter quarters. It wasn't all fancy then like it is now, and we'd go over and mow the weeds and pull weeds around the graves. And one of the men in the quorum said to me, he said, "Do you know where Rock Creek Hollow is?" And I said, "I don't have an idea. I don't know where it is, nor why." And he said, "Well, it's in Wyoming." And I said, "Well, tell me a little more about it. Wyoming's a big place, you know." And he said, "Well, it's where the Handcart people froze to death." And I said, "I've been there. I know where that is, and it's by Independence Rock." He said, "No, there was 2 companies." I said, "You're wrong. There was just one. I've been where they froze." And he said, "No, there was 2. I went home and got out my history of the church again, started reading again, and sure enough, there was the Willie Handcart Company. 3 months went by, and I completed my graduate studies, began to look for a job, found a job in, of all places, in Riverton, Wyoming. I never wanted to move back to Wyoming. I wanted to live in Colorado, but there was just exactly the job I wanted right here. I went to the stake president and said, "President, you need to call a new elders president." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because I'm moving." He said, "You can't move." I said, "I have to. I'm done with school. I quit my job. We gave up our apartment." He said, "You can't move." I said, "Why in the world can't I move?" He said, "Well, I was going to talk to you Sunday anyway." And he reached in the desk and pulled out the papers, and he said, "You've been called to be the bishop of your ward." I said, "How can I be the bishop? I don't even have a place to live." And we talked about it for a while. I was 25, and you know, you don't get that calling very often in your life. And I thought, you know, who's got the inspiration here, me or the stake president? Maybe we need to stay. He visited with me for a while, and then he said something profound. He said, "I don't know why, but something tells me you have to move to Wyoming. And always remember this, it's not important that you serve as a bishop. It's important that one time in your life you were worthy to be a bishop." We moved our family here and spent the worst 3 months I've ever had in my life. I didn't have a church job. I wasn't even a home teacher. And I thought, you know, maybe the stake president was right. Maybe we shouldn't have come here. I was called to the High Council. 3 months later, the stake presidency was changed, and 20 years ago tomorrow, I was called to serve in the stake presidency of this stake at the age of 27. I served for 9 years. One of the first things I did when we got here is I started asking everybody where Rock Creek Hollow was, and nobody knew. Finally, I found one lady. Her name's Donna Guard, and she said, "I believe I can get you there. I went there once as a little girl." She was in her 50s. The 4th of July, 1977, she took me and my family, my one little daughter, and we went to Rock Creek. And I felt something at Rock Creek that I had never before in my life felt. I didn't know what it was. I interpreted it as the little children who were freezing to death and crying. I didn't understand what it was, but Rock Creek was like a magnet. I just couldn't let it go. I went to the stake president that Sunday and said, "President, Pioneer Day is just a few weeks away. We've never celebrated that in this stake, and we need to. He said, why? We don't get the day off like they do in Utah. And I said, it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be on the 24th. But the closest Saturday there is, let's go to Rock Creek and celebrate Pioneer Day. And he said, where in the world is Rock Creek? I said, it's up on top of South Pass, out in the boonies. He said, nobody will come. He said, what's so important about Rock Creek? I said, that's where the Willie company froze to death. He said, there's nobody in this stake that's going to go up there. I said, President, they'll come if we feed them. And he said, we don't have the money to feed them. And I said, can we just have the Pioneer Day and I'll take care of the rest? And he said, sure, go ahead and announce it. So the next Sunday, which was 1 week before the celebration, I had it announced through the whole stake that we were going to celebrate Pioneer Day at Rock Creek Hollow, and the stake was providing dinner. The stake president called me into the office, and he said, I know you're just a young kid, but when I tell you something, that's the way it really is. And I said, well, what's wrong? I couldn't figure out what he's upset about. And he said, you said they were going to feed the stake. And I said, we are, but it's not going to cost anything. He said, no, you can't do that. I said, yeah, don't worry about it. You'll never get a bill. What I did was I went to every sister I could find in the stake and asked them to make 1 loaf of whole wheat bread. And if they were real generous too, we bought a big sack of raw onions and some milk. And we went up to Rock Creek, and that was our first dinner at Rock Creek Hollow. We had a slice of whole wheat bread, a slice of onion, and some milk. And we wanted to be authentic pioneer, you know. And there's sisters in the stake who still have not forgiven me for that because their kids' stomachs were so sour that night. But the same thing that happened to me happened to the stake. There was 500 and some odd people there that night, and everyone fell in love with Rock Creek. We didn't know why. We just did. Everyone went there when they had time. We celebrated Pioneer Day there for 7 years. We did everything wrong. We had the story wrong. The historical facts, we had them all fouled up. We trespassed on people's property. We did everything you can imagine. We did it, and we did it wrong. But we were having a lot of fun being wrong. After 7 years, the land ownership changed hands, and we were locked off of the Rock Creek property. We continued to hold Rock Creek at different places in our Pioneer Day, at different places in the stake. The stake presidency was changed, and after 9 years of being a counselor, I was called to be the stake president. The first conference 6 months later, that was the stake president's conference, I was the concluding speaker because I was the presiding authority. I got up and said my talk, and at the very end of the talk I said this. I said, as your stake president, I would ask you as a stake to pray about the Willie's project. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen, and sat down. My first counselor, President Kitchen, leaned over to me and he said, what in the world is the Willie's project? I said, I don't have a clue. I don't know. And he said, you just asked the whole stake to pray about the Willie's project, and you know what it is? And I said, I don't know. It was really kind of scary. For 2 years, a little over 2 years, as we traveled around the stake as the stake presidency, we'd visit primary and different things. And the little kids would get up in primary and say, Father in heaven, please bless President Lorimer so that he can understand the Willie's project. We had old people praying about the Willie's project. Everybody was praying about the Willie's project, and nobody knew what it was. Not even the stake president. I told my counselors after 2.5 years of this that, you know, maybe we ought to write the brethren in Salt Lake and tell them they needed to come and release us, because we had 2,000 people praying about something and none of us knew what it was, and it hadn't happened yet. So maybe we were wrong. And my counselors looked at me and said, no, let's just keep going. And so we did. And it was very, very humbling to have this army of people praying about something just because you asked them to. Everybody interpreted it that it was that we were supposed to buy Rock Creek. So we saved a lot of money. We saved all the money we could from the stake budget, and we had enough money to buy Rock Creek. Then that letter came out from Salt Lake City. Anyone who was a bishop at the time remembers the letter well. It said, there are no more stake budgets. We're going to give you an allotment from Salt Lake City. And then the fine print said, and by the way, if you have any extra money in your coffers, please send it to Salt Lake. Well, we had a decision to make. Do we buy Rock Creek, or do we be obedient and send the money to Salt Lake? It took about 5 seconds. We wrote the check out and signed it and sent it in. We thought we finally had understood it and we had the money to do it, and now all of a sudden we didn't have the money anymore. So what was the Willie's project? We didn't know. About that time we had a couple go to the Family History Library mission down in Salt Lake City, and they came back with a CD-ROM that we'd never seen before. We'd never seen one at all. And they also had a printout of each one of the members of the stake presidency's genealogy. President McKinnon was not near as embarrassed as the other two of us were, because he had a lot more done than we did. He didn't do it, but he had more done. And we realized we needed to get our genealogy done. But President McKinnon got all excited about getting some of those computers that would take CD-ROMs to do family history. At that time in our stake, we had 2 ladies, older women, who did genealogy. Nobody else in our stake even knew how to spell genealogy. But he decided we needed not 1, but 2 of those computers. So we started writing Salt Lake, and we wrote to the folks in the big white building and said, you know, we're from Wyoming and we want 2 computers. And they'd write back and say, there's only 5 of these in the church, and they're all on the Wasatch Front. You can't have one. So we'd write back and say, but we really need them. We didn't know why we needed them. We just thought we did. And they'd keep writing back. Then they'd say, you're on the list and you're number 9,482, you know. Someday before the millennium, you'll get your computers. So we kept doing this. And finally, President McKinnon got so perturbed with the whole process that he took a day off of work and drove to Salt Lake City. And instead of going to the Family History Department, for some reason, he went to purchasing. And he said, I'm not leaving here until you guys fill out the purchase orders and get us 2 of these computers with the CD-ROMs. We got to have them. And Brother Alan Reddish in purchasing didn't know what to do. So he filled out the purchase order, and he said, okay, you'll get them. And President McKinnon came back to the stake presidency meeting all excited. Said, man, we're going to get these computers. This is going to be great. We got a letter the next week that said, it was a mistake. You can't have them. It's not going to happen. The next week, it was unbelievable. I came home from work, and there was boxes all over my living room. 2 complete computer systems, the printers, the keyboards, the screens, the CD-ROMs, everything we needed. 2 complete systems. There were 7 in the church, and we had 2 of them in Wyoming. I mean, it was unbelievable. So we thought, well, what are we going to do with these now? We got them. We don't have anybody doing genealogy. So we went over to Lander and set that one up over there, played around with it for a while, found ourselves, so we knew at least how to run the thing, kind of, sort of. And we left President Kitchen there to teach the family history librarians how to run it. We didn't know how to run it. And President McKinnon and I went out to the Wind River branch. That's our Lamanite branch. We had some business to do out there. And we were driving out there. It's about 15 miles out to the branch. And President McKinnon was sitting over in the passenger side of the car, and he began to feel a little guilty about what we'd done. He said, you know, why did we push so hard? He said, you know, maybe this time we went a little too far. maybe we don't need these computers. You know, the church has spent a lot of money on us, and we don't even have anybody doing genealogy. And he was over there saying things like that. And in a form of communication that I had never before experienced, I knew why. And I turned to him and I said, President, it's the Willie people. And he said, what in the world made you think of that? I said, I don't know. But their temple work is not done. Now that was an absurd statement. It was impossible. How in the world could these people, whose story's been told all over the world, of dedication, devotion to the gospel, sacrifice, how in the world could they not have their temple work done? It was impossible. Intellectually it was impossible, but spiritually I knew what I knew. We did our business at the Wind River branch. I'll tell you a little funny thing that happened there. We were starved. Our days in the stake presidency usually start at 5 a.m. and they end at somewhere between 10 and midnight. We very seldom eat anything. We never are home. And so we get hungry during the day, and although I'm the stake president, I also am the scrounger, and I'm always able to find us something to eat. That day at the Wind River branch, President McKinnon was working on the computer, and I went in the kitchen, and there was a whole box of ice cream and an apple pie. So I cut the apple pie in half and put half on each plate, put it in the oven and warmed it up, and then put ice cream on it, and took it in. And President McKinnon says, where in the world did you get that? I said, don't worry about it, just eat it. And he said, did you steal this? I said, the PFR manual says you're not supposed to leave food in the church. So whoever left this in here shouldn't have done that. So just eat it. We're helping them keep the rules. So we were sitting there wolfing down this apple pie a la mode, and we thought we were all alone in the building when we went in there. But the branch president, who's a large laymanite, came in, and he caught us just red-handed. I mean, and he's standing there at the door. His name is Louis Twitchell, and he just shook his head, and he said, once a deacon, always a deacon. So we ate our pie, and we hurried up over here to Riverton, and we put the computer together here in the Family History Center. And President McKinnon said, we don't even know their names. I said, yeah, I know, but we have a picture of a marker that's at Rock Creek, and you'll see the marker at Rock Creek. It's a little granite marker that Paul Willie, who's a direct descendant of James Willie, gave me in 1979, and I had an Eagle Scout put it up at Rock Creek. On that marker are the names of the 13 plus the 2 who died at Rock Creek. So I came down to the stake president's office and was rummaging through all the old stuff we had and found a little photograph of that marker. Went back down to the Family History Center. President McKinnon by then had the computer together, and he said, give me a name. I don't know why I gave him the name I gave him. Maybe it's because I have 6 daughters. But there's only one little girl buried at Rock Creek. So I said, look up Bodia Mortensen. So he typed in her name. We waited and we stuffed in and out the CDs. And I will never, ever, ever forget the feeling that came over us as we saw that screen come up with her name and no temple ordinances. We all react to things differently because of the way we were raised. President McKinnon is a very accomplished violinist. He's played his violin all over the world. He's a school administrator here and doesn't play his violin much anymore. I, on the other hand, grew up playing football. played college football. I was so excited when I saw that. I jumped up and said, President, if all of this is for this one little girl, if all these prayers for 2.5 years are for her, it's been worth it. And I slapped him on the back and he knocked him clear out of the chair. And we both were having a real hard time controlling our emotions. He crawled back up in the chair and said, give me another name, just don't hit me again. I looked at the list again and said, look at James Kirkwood. He looked up James Kirkwood, same thing. We then had confirmed to us from the most recent technology we had from the church that the spiritual feelings we'd had on the way to the Wind River branch were correct. We were still worried about it, though. We met here as a stake presidency the next morning at 6 a.m., and we submitted all 13 names the old way on the little cards to see if the church could figure out the same thing we had. We sent them in. We didn't tell them what we were doing or who they were. We just sent them in. We waited and waited and waited. 4 weeks went by, and a letter finally came, and it said we were right. Then we knew that we had a responsibility. We knew that we as a stake had been given an unbelievable opportunity to be of service. We wondered, how do we do this? The first 13, when we processed those names and got clearance to do them in the Ogden Temple, we invited the High Council and their families to come down and do the temple work for those 13. Whoever could go. It was during a work week day, so it was hard for some people to get off of work. But we made sure that we had enough names for everybody to do a name. The kids to do the baptistry work and the adults to do the endowments. As it turned out, there was enough names that each one of our children could be baptized for one of the Willie people. And there was enough for each member of the stake presidency to be baptized. We did the baptisms, the 3 members of the stake presidency. We took our children down in the font and baptized them. Those people were there. They were so thrilled to be in the house of the Lord, having their work done for them. Emotions were really hard to control. But when we baptized each other, I remember baptizing President Kitchen. You know, they only made one of him. He's been with me for the whole 12 years, both of them have. Plus President Kitchen and I were together for 6 years before that, and he's just a great, great man. The measure of President Kitchen is in children. I have never seen a child afraid of President Kitchen. He loves children. We'd sit here around this table doing the research, and he'd be sitting over here. Those were 18, 24-hour days. He'd be sitting over here after not having eaten anything for that time, and you'd hear a giggle over here, and you knew what had happened. President John Levi Kitchen had found a child buried at sea, a child lost on the plains. When I baptized him, I thought of the children. When I baptized President McKinnon, I thought of the intellect, the spirituality of this great man. He's so obedient. If the Lord commanded him to take his son to the mountain and sacrifice him like Abraham did Isaac, he would. He's just a magnificent individual. When they baptized me, we have a lot of fun together, too. President Kitchen held me down on the bottom of the fountain. Wouldn't let me up. That caused a little bit of a disturbance. And then when President McKinnon got ready to baptize me, he said, President, just go straight down, just go straight down, just please, just go straight down. He said, I'll never get you out of here if you don't. So we had some fun with it, but it was an incredible experience. When we got out of the font, we were in the locker room, and we were having so much fun. We were like little deacons again, you know, saying, "Whoa, was that cool or what?" You know, and this temple worker came back and he said, "Brethren, this is the house of the Lord, and you need to be reverent." And then he saw who it was, and he says, "Oh, I'm sorry, you guys can do whatever you want." we said, no, we need to be reverent just like everybody else. But we were so excited to finally get to do those baptisms for those people. It was really something. As it turned out, James Kirkwood didn't need to be baptized. The initial CD-ROM was wrong. He had been baptized. We had to do the other work for him, but he didn't be baptized. Bodil, I gave my second counselor, President McKinnon, the names and said, "President, you assign them however you want. I only am going to assign one of them." And he said, "Which one?" And I said, "I want your wife to take Bodil's name through." They never, ever lived in the shadow of a temple that was done. They couldn't go do it. Then it was assumed by family tradition that it was all done. But it wasn't. And so when we sealed little Bodil to her parents, I'm sure if we would have opened our eyes and been able to see with spiritual eyes, we would have seen her. We didn't, but I'm sure we would have if we could have. That little girl, she's a very special little girl. She has touched the hearts of prophets and common people like me. She's become the sweetheart of our stake. This one, of course, is of Bodil and James Kirkwood going over Rocky Ridge. It's got an interesting story behind it. A priest by the name of Phil Neberker came to me in 1994 when we were working on Rock Creek, 1993. He was running a backhoe, and he jumped off the backhoe, and he came over to me. He says, "President Lorimer, I really want to go on my mission." I said, "Well, there's no reason you can't, is there?" He said, "No." He said, "I'm worthy." I said, "Well, let's fill out the paperwork." He said, "I can't." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, you know, my brother Doug's in Bulgaria on a mission, and my family can't afford two of us at the same time." I said, "Well, heaven's sakes, that's not a problem. There's a lot of people in our stake that would love to help you." He said, "President, I don't want to be a welfare case." I said, "That's not being a welfare case. We want to help you." And he said, "No, I can't do that." He said, "All I want to ask you is if I promised the Lord that I would save my money, do you think he would make a way available for me to make enough money to go on my mission?" And one of those times that you do as a stake president, I said, "Phil, I promise you, as your stake president, that will happen." He got back on the backhoe and kept working. A few weeks later, he was out sage hunting or elk hunting or something, and he got trapped in a blizzard with his buddies. They were out there for 3 days. Almost froze to death. They're in a cave, and they had the watches, and they'd have the buzzer go off on their watch every 15 minutes, so they'd have to rotate in this cave, and that's the only thing that kept them alive from freezing to death. The Fremont County Rescue people gave up on them, so members of our stake went out and found them, brought them back, took them down to the hospital, and they had some frostbite and a lot, sent them home. Well, Phil couldn't sleep because every time he'd start to fall asleep, he'd have nightmares about freezing to death, and he'd wake up. So his family would find him out in the living room at night, in the middle of the night, carving blocks of soap and all kinds of junk, just whittling with his mom's paring knife. And he carved a horse's head out of a block of soap that won first place in the Winter's Fair. So in October of 1995, he calls me up and he says, "President Lorimer, are you going to be home after conference?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, I got this thing I want to show you." So he comes over with this thing. It's on his mom's cutting board, and it's a block of beeswax. I said, "Phil, I didn't know you did this kind of stuff." He says, "I've never done it before." He says, "But I just want you to look at it and see if it's okay." I said, "Well, it looks great." I said, "I assume this is Bodil and Jens Nielsen and James Kirkwood and Joseph Kirkwood." He said, "That's right." He said, "They're going over Rocky Ridge." He said, yep, that's right. I said, well, it's great. I said, but Phil, we can't help you as a stake finance. And I said, we bought the molds for this, but we don't have any money to do this. He said, oh, no. He says, I don't want any money. He said, I just want to know if they look okay. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, look at their faces. He said, do they look like they look like? I said, I don't know what they look like, but I'll look at them. So I looked at them. I said, yeah, they look okay to me. He said, that's all I wanted to know. He picked up his mom's cutting board and left. And next thing I knew, he had gone down to Spanish Fork and found a foundry that would cast this for him. And his dad was upset with him because he'd taken all the money he'd saved for his mission and cast this thing in bronze. But he had it sold to his bishop, so he was okay. So he went down to pick it up. And the guy at the foundry said, you know, has anybody at the church seen this thing? He said, no. He said, you really need to take this up to the church office building and show them. He said, I don't need to take it to the church office building. He says, no, really. He said, I know Glenn Leonard, and you need to take it up there for the sesquicentennial. So he called Brother Leonard, and we knew Brother Leonard. Phil didn't know him. Called Brother Leonard, and Brother Leonard agreed to see him. So he went up to see Brother Leonard, and he's in his Levi's that have holes in them, an old woolen shirt that has holes, and tennis shoes. And he's carrying this bronze. And he goes in the great white building, and he goes up to where they go, where Brother Leonard was, and he gets to Brother Leonard's office, and Brother Leonard meets him at the door, and he says, I started thinking about it. And I said to myself in my mind, Riverton, Handcarts, Hinckley. He said, you need to go see President Hinckley. This kid from our stake says, I don't want to go see President Hinckley. He said, I already called him, and he's waiting for you over there in that granite building. So this kid from our stake goes over there in his grubbies with his bronze to see President Hinckley. He sets it down on the table, and President Hinckley gets down on his hands and knees and crawls around and looks at their faces. Stands up and says, how much do you want for it? And the kid says, it's not for sale. And the President says, why isn't it for sale? He said, because I sold it to my bishop. And the President put his arm around Phil and he said, young man, I promise you, your bishop's going to understand. So he wouldn't tell him what he wanted for it. So President finally just got his personal checkbook out and wrote him a check. And he said, I want my wife to have this for Valentine's Day. And gave him the check and said, is that enough? And it was way more than Phil ever dreamed of selling it for. And Phil said, yeah. He said, that's fine. He said, I guess I better get out of here. So he left, came home with his check, and had another one made. By the time he actually went on his mission to Portugal, he had his mission paid for.
For some must push and some must pull as we go marching up the hill. So merrily on the way we go until we reach the valley. Oh.
A man by the name of Claire Bankhead called and asked us to come down as a presidency and make a presentation on Rock Creek. We wrote 3 little books, and we went down and made a presentation to Claire Bankhead about Rock Creek and the second rescue of the Willie and the Martin Handcart companies. We gave him the 3 books. After we gave him the 3 books and the presentation, he shoved them back across the table at us and said, I don't want these. And I thought to myself, I know we're from Wyoming. You know, it's not that bad. Just 3 guys, you know, from Wyoming. And he said, oh no, it's not that. He said, I shouldn't have them. President Hinckley should. And I said, well, next time you see him, why don't you give them to him? And he said, no, you go give them to him right now. And as I remember, I said, I don't even know where he lives. And he said, well, it's over there in that granite building. And I'm going to call his secretary, and you go over there and give it to him. So we went down there and went in the big granite building. And, of course, the security man was there. And he said, are you the 3 guys from Wyoming? We said, yeah, we're the 3 guys from Wyoming. He said, now you're here to see the president. I said, no, we're not. I said, they asked us to give him these books, but we don't want to see President Hinckley. And he said, I can't believe that. You don't want to see him? And I said, it's not that we don't want to see him. He's busy. He doesn't have time to see us. Just give him these 3 books and we'll go back to Wyoming. So we turned around and left, went and had some split pea soup and came home. We also met with the Ogden Temple Presidency on the way home and told them what we were doing. And they had to make an enormous amount of adjustments to accommodate this. Because what was going to happen was every member of our stake over the age of 12 was going to have a name of one of the pioneers or their rescuers. That name would be assigned to that person, and they'd go to the temple and do the work. So the Ogden Temple had to set up a whole series of mechanisms to accommodate that, and they were unbelievably kind to us. Those people were prepared to help us to do what we had to do. We came home and we had scheduled a meeting that was an unusual meeting, and it's not an authorized church meeting, and you can't hold these kind of meetings with the exception of the approval of the area presidency. And what we held was a stake-wide sacrament meeting where the concept of the second rescue was introduced to the Riverton, Wyoming stake. 4 days before the sacrament meeting, President Hinckley called me. It's the first time that he'd ever called. He's called many times since, and it never, ever, ever becomes familiar when one of them call. President Hinckley that day reminded me of Brigham Young. You know, when you read the journals about the Willie and the Martin people coming into the valley, you read that Brigham Young went out to meet the handcarts and the wagons, and that when he saw the children with their feet frozen and their fingers frozen, that Brigham Young wept and said, "Why have they had to suffer so?" That day on the phone, President Hinckley said a lot of things. He wept, and he said, "Why have they had to wait so long?" It had been 135 years since they were here in Wyoming. It was interesting to us that we had just barely passed the time period at that time that you could do work for somebody who was dead that wasn't directly related to you. We received at that time from President Hinckley the authorization to hold the sacrament meeting, and he said if we didn't, and if we didn't complete the work, that it would be a sin. He also said, "President Lorimer, don't you stop until this is done, both the temple work and the acquisition of the lands of the Willie and the Martin people." After that phone call, I was kind of loaded up. I mean, the weight was pretty heavy. You know, how do you do all that? How do you acquire the lands? How do you get the temple work done? The only way you can do it is to have an army. And we had one. We held that sacrament meeting. The Ogden Temple Presidency was here. We gave the bishops packets of names and asked them to kneel in prayer with their councils and assign the names of the Willie and the Martin people to their people. The Stake Center the Stake Family History Center was scheduled in half-hour increments starting at 6 a.m. until 10 o'clock at night every day except Sunday and Monday night. You couldn't get in the Family History Center. This stake was completely on fire. We have deacons' quorums to this day who run Temple Ready, who research their own ancestry, process the names, take them to Ogden, and do the temple work. We have 4 quorums in this stake whose quorum presidencies have given the assignment to their quorums. These are Aaronic priesthood quorums of 300 names per quarter of their own ancestry. These kids can do genealogy like nobody's business, and they do it right. The high priests don't stand a chance. We can't do the endowments fast enough. We can't get it done. If you go down to Ogden, you'll see in the family history file center, there's little drawers that say A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then you get to R, and then there's a whole file cabinet that says Riverton, and then it's because of these kids. We can't keep up with them. But the kids and everybody was down at the Family History Center working on family history. It was an unbelievable time. There was such a powerful spirit in our stake. We had many, many general authorities come. I think at first they came to figure out what we were doing. Were we for real, or were we trying to become general authorities, or what were we doing up here? And they came and found out that we weren't doing any of that. We just were trying to do what we were supposed to. The first general authority that came was Elder Tingy. He got here on Friday instead of on Saturday for our conference. He interviewed me until 2 a.m. He knew more about me than I knew about myself when it was over. I told him I'd give him my blood type if he wanted it. We took him out on the trail the next day. He didn't say anything about what we were doing in our conference. We didn't know if he was in agreement or disagreement with us. At the very end of the conference, he told us that he was responsible for a new program. That was one of his responsibilities. It was called Temple Ready. Because before we had to get the discs, send the discs in, they'd send them back. But now there was a new program that you didn't have to do that anymore. He said, I think I can get you one of the first copies of that. But he says, first, we have to prove some things. There were some challenges amongst people. They really did wonder what we were doing up here. Some people just flat didn't believe that that could have happened. One of them was the director of the Family History Department at that time, and I won't tell you his name, but I'll tell you about him. He's a good man. He's a sealer in the Salt Lake Temple. He's a really good man. But he could not believe that the temple work for the Willie and the Martin people was not done. He talked to Elder Tingy before he came up here, told him some things to find out from us. Elder Tingy went back and reported. Elder Tingy called me after meeting with him, and he said, President Lorimer, we want to prove factually what you know intellectually. I said, fine. I said, have whoever call me. It doesn't bother me. So the man called me, and he said, President, I want the names of the 13 people at Rock Creek. I said, okay. I said, have you got a fax machine? He said, yeah, and I said, check it. It's coming right now. I said, I want to prove this so bad. I want you to know what we know. And he said, okay, we're going to put the best people the church has on it. He said, send us all of your research. I said, oh no, that's cheating. You start where we started. You get 13 names. They took the 13 names. They went back to their country of origin and first tried to prove that they were never born. They proved that all 13 had been born. Then they tried to prove that they'd never joined the church. They proved that every one of them did. Then they tried to prove that they never came west in the Willie Handcart Company. They proved that everyone did. Then they tried to prove that they didn't die at Rock Creek. They proved unquestionably that every one of them did. Then they tried to understand, after they'd done all that, then they started tackling the temple work. About 4 months went by, and I got a call from Elder Tingy, and he said, President, how's the weather up there? I said, it's good. He said, how's your day? And I said, it's really good. He said, well, it's going to get better. He said, I won't tell you what's going to happen. I just wanted to tell you that your day's going to be better. We parted. Elder Tingey's become a great friend. He'd call me from South Africa from time to time when he was down there, and he still calls from time to time. He was up here last year. This man from the Family History Department called shortly after Elder Tingey, and he said, President Lorimer, we've concluded our research. He said, I want you to know that you were wrong. And I said, well, I'm glad you feel that way, but if you keep working, you'll find out that we were right. And he said, no, I can prove now, factually, that you were wrong. And I said, well, I'm glad that you can, but I still don't believe it. And he said, well, you are. There is one more temple ordinance that needs to be done than you thought there needed to be. And then he became very, very emotional. And he said, President Lorimer, I am so sorry. And I said, sorry for what? He said, I'm so sorry that I couldn't feel this. He said, I'm not a bad man. I said, I know you're not. He said, I'm really sorry that I couldn't feel what the other brethren were feeling and what you felt. And I said, oh heavens, everybody that's ever touched this project has had a purpose. Your purpose was to prove intellectually what we knew spiritually. And then he said, well, I'm glad I could play a part, but it's not a role that I would have selected for myself. Great man. He came to all the dedications. He was a very important part of what happened. So we began the second rescue. Unbelievable experiences happened during our time with the Martin and the Willie people. It was pretty well self-contained in this stake. It didn't go anywhere other than here until October of 1991, which was about, I guess, 7 or 8 months into it. And we had begun to get some phone calls from people because people had heard about it. And so it wasn't unusual to get phone calls. And one day I was sitting at home reading some letters that we'd gotten, and the phone rang. It was Saturday morning. I was sitting in the chair next to the bed, and my wife was still sleeping, and I answered the phone. And I have a terrible time with names. I can't remember people's names. So oft times when I meet people, I'll repeat their name back to them. And so this morning, the guy told me his name, and I said, Del Van Orden, do I know you? And my wife just, she sat up in bed. She got a piece of paper and she wrote on it, and she showed me. She said, that's one of the big guys. Elder Van Orden. I don't know an Elder Van Orden. And then she could see that I was a little perplexed, so she wrote underneath that, he's the editor of the Church News. He buys ink by the barrel. And then underneath that, she wrote in great big letters, be nice. So Brother Van Orden started asking me all these questions, and I said, well, you know, that's what we're doing. He was a descendant of one of the Martin people, so he was interested in it from that angle too. And he said, we want to do a church news article about you guys. And I said, you can't do it. We don't want any church news articles. That's not why we're doing this. We don't want to be in the church news. And he said, well, you know, it'd really help you. And I said, no, it won't help us at all. We don't want to be in the newspaper. And so he gave me about 10 reasons why they ought to do this article in the church news. And I told him no to every one of them. And unbeknownst to me, President Hinckley had just spoken about us in a temple preparation, or a temple president seminar. And President Monson was in the seminar, and he called Brother Van Orden and said, get a story about this. And so finally, after 10 tries, Brother Van Orden says, well, would it make any difference at all to you if President Monson wants a story? And I said, well, if President wants a story, go ahead and do it. So they wrote a story in October of 1991 about the second rescue of the Willie and the Martin Handcart companies. Unbelievable things started happening. I mean, the phone just didn't quit ringing. Letters just came out of nowhere. It was the most touching thing of the whole thing, though. Since 1991, we received over 7,000 letters. We've tried to answer every one, but we've never, ever received one letter of criticism. Not one. They've all been of encouragement, wanting to know about ancestry, wanting to know about what was happening. Those letters proved invaluable, because with the letters came journals. Thousands and thousands of pages of journals. We have over 60,000 pages of journals of just the Willie and the Martin people. President Hinckley said it's the most complete history in the church. He wants it in Salt Lake, but we haven't given it up yet. And those journals helped us do the family history work. A couple more things about the family history, and then depending on how tired you are, maybe we can show you some things that happened. The family history experience in our stake was unbelievable. There's a piece of paper that I'll show you in a few minutes of a lady in our stake. Her name's Mary Herford. She is a Lamanite, full-blooded Shoshone Indian. And she was given the name in this stake sacrament meeting of Ephraimine Wickland, who was a little 2-year-old girl. They were just pieces of paper, and they had the pioneer's name on it, and then they had the person's name on it that was doing the research, and then any information that we had on them. Sister Herford's home burned down to the ground about 3 weeks after she got this piece of paper. It was a mobile home. Her husband was inactive, wouldn't let her go to church, wouldn't let her go to the Family History Center to do the research on this name, and their home burned down. And when they went back in the home after the fire was put out, laying on the table, a little coffee table or end table, was this piece of paper. And when you look at the piece of paper, you can see the watermarks on it from where they put the fire out. And the paper is just charred. It's brittle. It got so hot. And laying on top of the piece of paper, when you see it, we just have a photograph. President Hinckley did take that and put it in Salt Lake somewhere. It looks like popsicle sticks or fingernail files or something. We're laying on top of that, and one of the popsicle sticks or fingernail files covers up the name Mary Herford, our sister. And another one covered up the name Ephraimine Wickland, the little pioneer girl. So this piece of paper is just charred. But underneath those two sticks, it's brilliant white. Their two names were not burned. Sister Herford came in just shaking, carrying this piece of paper. She says, President Lawler, I don't know what this little girl needs, but she needs something really bad. And sure enough, little Ephraimine Wickland needed to be sealed to her parents, and she hadn't had her endowments. Circumstances, I don't think so. We had a little girl in our stake whose family was given the name of Hosea Stout. He was one of the rescuers to research, and Hosea Stout was a very prominent man in Utah, was a polygamist, and had many descendants. This little girl's family was given Hosea Stout, and they were having trouble finding some of the information. Their half hour was just about up. It was 9:30, and the kids were getting a little squirrely, and they wanted to go home. The father said, let me stay for the last few minutes. We've got this computer, and see if I can find him. And one of the daughters stayed with him. As luck would have it, just 2 minutes after they left, the father and the one daughter found everything. They were excited. They went home cheering and yelling and screaming, telling everybody in the family that they'd found it. There was a little 12-year-old girl who just kind of disappeared. She went in her bedroom. The father and mother went to the door and listened through the door, and the little girl was calling her bishop. And she said, Bishop, are there any more names? And he said, I don't have any, except for one man. She said, can I have the man? The bishop said, why? She said, I wasn't there. I didn't get to see it. I want to find somebody. So the bishop gave that little girl, 12 years old, the name of James Alfred Peacock, knowing that she could never do one single ordinance for him. That little girl had been given one of the roughest names that we had. She ordered microfilm after microfilm from Salt Lake City, trying to find James Alfred Peacock. She couldn't find him. She knew, though, that the Lord would help her. She wasn't going to give up. She was going to find him because her stake president had asked her to. Finally, she got a film and found the baptismal record of James Alfred Peacock. Was able to submit his name and let somebody else do it. We had people drive 6 hours one way to do one baptism, and they were thrilled to do it. They were honored to be able to go into the house of the Lord and do some work for a friend that they'd found. It hasn't stopped. Now they're finding their own ancestry, finding their own people. It's been a great blessing to us. I wish we could have stayed in that 4-year period. People were so busy in our stake, they didn't have time to get in trouble. We didn't have one disciplinary council. It wasn't because we weren't holding them and should have been. There just wasn't any to hold.
For some must push and some must pull as we go marching up the hill. So merrily on the way we go until we reach the valley. Oh.
6 months into the second rescue, I guess it was really 7 months into the second rescue, I was in a priesthood leadership meeting. And I said, you know, there's nothing to commemorate these people that we've learned to love. We need to build monuments to them. We need a monument at Martin's Cove. We need one at the Willie Rescue Site, and we need one at Rocky Ridge. And I need your help to build them. We will build the monuments. Nothing will come from outside the boundaries of this stake. We'll build the monuments ourselves as a monument to those people who we so much love. I sat down, and my first counselor leaned over to me again. He said, why do you say things like that? He said, we're on our knees trying to do this temple work, and you want us to build 3 monuments. I said, yeah, we need to build 3 monuments. He said, we can't. We're running back and forth to Ogden. We're doing all this. So we can build the monuments. The monuments were a wonderful, wonderful experience for us. It was a great time. I remember the first day we went to Rocky Ridge. We had air compressors and trucks and jackhammers, and we had cement mixers. We had everything you can imagine up on top of Rocky Ridge. And John Larson turned to me and he said, why don't we just build a temple? He said, we got enough people. I said, boy, I'm all for it, but I think we got to get permission. And the monuments, the rock that you'll see on the monuments, was hauled all the way from LaBarge, Wyoming. LaBarge to Martin's Cove, from the quarry to Martin's Cove, was about 170 miles one way. The brethren hauled 9 semi-flatbed loads of rock to build those 3 monuments. We had a brick mason who was an inactive member of the church, and I went to him and I said, Brother Carter, we need to build some monuments. He said, where do you want them? So I told him, and he said, I'll build them. Problem with Brother Carter was he would not put a stone on those monuments unless it was perfect in every way. That's why we had to haul 9 loads of rocks. And when you see Rocky Ridge and realize we had semi-trucks up there, you wonder how in the world we did that. I guess we were a little crazy, but we did it. We also And maybe I should just stop with the bronzes. I'll tell you about the bronzes, and then maybe we should stop, or whatever you want to do. I didn't want anodized aluminum plaques on our monuments. Those are easy to make. We own a company called the Brunton Company, and we make anodized aluminum plaques all the time. And people shoot them and do all kinds of bad things to them. We wanted a first-class bronze monument. And so I went to Brother Fabricius and Brother Worth, and I said, you know you guys don't know anything about pouring bronze, do you? And they said, we don't know nothing about pouring bronze. I said, would you make me some bronze plaques? I said, sure, we'll make you some bronze plaques. What do you want to say? I said, I don't know. But let's figure out how to do it. So we ordered some books on how to do bronzes. We learned later that there's two ways to do bronzes. There's the lost wax method and there's the sand casting method. But we ordered a book on lost wax, and so that's what we did. We figured that's the only way to do it. Well, you can't do what we did with the lost wax method, but we did it. And President Faust, I'll tell you how he got involved in all that. We ordered some letters from Florida, some little plastic letters, and you'll see them in there. And then we made a mold, and we had to glue each one of those letters on there. And you know, there's no spell checker when you're doing that kind of stuff. And you got to space the letters. But the first thing we did was we wrote the text for it, and we wanted it to be okay, so we sent it into the church. And they sent it to church correlation, church history, church editing, church this, church that. I didn't know there was so much church. You know, everybody took a shot at us, putting commas here and deleting words. And it was crazy. Finally, they gave it back to us and said, okay, go ahead and do it. So we did. And they asked us if we wanted some money, and we said, no, we don't want any money. We're just doing this. And they said, well, how are you going to afford this? And I said, I don't know. We just will. So we start making these, we get these little letters and sticking them on, and oh, jeepers, creepers, a mess. And then we were going to go up to one of those old monuments that George Albert Smith made with the buffalo on it, you know. And we were going to make a rubber mold of that and put it on our plaques until we saw what it said. We thought it said, all is well, Brigham Young, you know. But it says Utah Historical Trails Association. We thought, oh, you know. So he said, we can't use that. And we were standing there looking at it, and I said, besides that, it's a dead buffalo. This isn't about dead buffalo. This is about pioneers. So I said, let's make a handcart scene. Everybody looked at me like, how are you going to make a handcart scene? I said, I don't know. I said, I was in Gettysburg not long ago, and I bought a little cannon. We could take the wheels off it. Maybe we could somehow make this. So we were in here on the High Council room taking this cannon apart, trying to make these. Oh, geez, what a farce. So I went home that night and was praying about it. How are we going to get this handcart scene? The next Sunday, I was praying about it in the morning, and I thought, I know how I'm going to do it. We've got a guy in our stake that's, he has a master's degree in electrical engineering. He's a computer scientist. Very intelligent guy, very obedient guy. He didn't want to move to Silicon Valley to earn a living, so he moved back to his native home of Du Bois, Wyoming, and started carving antlers to make a living, of all things, you know, belt buckles and artwork and stuff. The guy does unbelievably well carving this stuff. So I thought, I'm going to have President Baker, he's a branch president for us, I said, I'm going to have him carve us a scene. So I drove up to Du Bois that day with my counselors, and I had a block of walnut. And I said, President, could you carve me a handcart scene on this block of walnut? He looked straight at me and he said, no. And this is a guy that would catch bullets in his teeth for you, you know, I mean, he's obedient. I said, President Baker, I can't believe he said no. He said, I can't do it. I said, why not? You carved everything else. His artwork is unbelievable. It sells all over the world. He said, I can't carve it on walnut. He said, can I carve it on antler? I said, I don't care what you carve it on. We just need some artwork. So he carved this handcart scene that you'll see on the bronzes tomorrow, and you'll see it in here, on the bowl of a moose antler. So it's curved. So it looks like the people are really moving. It's really neat. We took that, we stuck it in the clay. Then we had our mold ready with all the words in there. Then we poured this rubber junk in there. Then we take the mold all apart, pick all the letters out. Then we had to have the laurels and the priest come along with toothbrushes and tweezers and clean out all the extra rubber out from where it slipped underneath the letters. When we got the molds cleaned up, then we began the process of pouring wax. I asked all the stakes, the sisters in the stake, to donate their skillets and their crock pots. We had about 40 of them that sisters had given us. Some of them were brand new. And we took this ugly old wax and we put it in there and melted it. And we get it up to 300 degrees and pour it into these rubber molds. And you'll see some of them in there. And then we would pull the rubber mold off the wax. Well, the problem is little bubbles get trapped in those letters. And if the bubbles, if you don't fix them, then when you make the bronze, you got a bubble in the letter. And it's ugly. So how are we going to get those bubbles out of there? So I called BYU and I said, you got to help me, the art department. I said, we're making these bronzes and we can't get the bubbles out of the letters. He said, you can't do what? I said, we can't get the bubbles out of the letters. He said, wait a minute, tell me what you're doing. So I told him, he said, you are crazy. He said, you can't do it that way. I said, we don't have a choice. We don't have time. We have to do it this way. He said, it will never work. I said, it has to work. He said, it won't work. So I came home, I thought, how are we going to do this? So I got as many people as I could around that mold. Each one of them had one toothpick. And we divided the mold up into sections. And you had about 35 seconds to get the bubbles out of those letters. And so we pour the wax in, everybody be chasing bubbles out of the letters, you know. And when you pulled the rubber off, you could tell who did their job. And we never got it perfected. So I thought, okay, we got it down to where we're only getting 2 or 3 letters in each casting that's got bubbles. How can we fix those bubbles? So I was sitting there one day and I thought, I know how to do it. Dentists, they're always fooling around in your mouth with these little tools. We can touch the letters up with dental tools. So I called our dentist. We've got 3 of them. I said, I need all your dental tools. You got little shovels and screwdrivers and things. They've got unbelievable tools plowing around your mouth with. They gave me all these old tools that they had. They were perfect. We could touch up the littlest flaw in those letters. It was great stuff. So we had the sisters trained to do that. And then after we got the waxes to work, then we had to make the slurry that made the cask around the wax. We took an old milk can and we made a roller, a drum roller thing to roll it so that it would keep fluid all the time, 24 hours a day. Then we started making the slurry on the outside of waxes. You have to build up, I think it's 18 coats of this junk on these things. And then when we got that done, then we had to have an oven to put this in to bake the wax out of. So we were just going to put it in our wives' ovens and bake the wax out. And they said, no, you're not doing that. We said, we have to. And they said, no, you're not doing that in our ovens. And the only thing that saved the ovens was the mold wouldn't fit in there. So then we had to build an oven. So we took a big old piece of culvert, about this big around, cut it off, and we built an oven to put these things in. And we had this chain thing that would lift up. It was crazy what we were doing. But we put it in there, and then we had to figure out how to heat it, because you had to heat it up to 1,800 degrees to burn the wax out. So then we got the propane and everything, figured out how to do that, put oxygen in it, got it so that it would burn all that out of there. So then we were finally ready to go, we thought, but we realized we didn't have a kiln to melt the bronze. So we built the kiln out of a 55-gallon drum, and we lined it with fire brick, and we got it so the fire would swirl around that crucible. And we had to build all the tools to lift that thing out of the fire with, and all of the stuff to move the crucible around it. The bronze is 2,300 degrees when you bring it up out of there. And we didn't have one stitch of protective clothing. We were doing this in a guy's driveway. We were crazy for what we were doing, but we were going to do this. First time we did it, we lifted up that thing, and Ron reached in there, Ron Fabricius, and he grabbed a hold of that ceramic mold. It's just like a piece of china. It's like glass. And all he had was 2 little pieces of asbestos rags and leather gloves. And when he grabbed that thing at 1900 degrees, the smoke just came off of him. You could see the radiant heat just bouncing off of him. And he just grabbed that thing and he brought it out and he brought it over and he laid it down in this vermiculite stuff we had. And then we poured the bronze. Well, we did that. And every time we did it, the edges of the bronze would break the ceramic shell because it couldn't stand the heat because it was too sharp of an edge. And every time we did it, 80 pounds of molten bronze ran down his driveway and was ruined. And we were getting a little discouraged because it was July 22nd. And we had the monuments done, but we didn't have any bronzes. And President Hinckley was coming on August 15th. He'd called and asked if he could come to dedicate the monuments. So we were 3 weeks away and we didn't have anything to dedicate. We get a phone call. It's President Faust, and Elder Faust at the time. He said, "Could I come up there?" Sure. You guys got to understand, there had never been, until 1997, the president of the church had never been in central Wyoming. Never been here. Quorum of the 12, you could count them on 2 or 3 fingers. They just didn't come here. And because there was nothing to see, there's nothing to do here. And President Faust called and said, "Could we come up there?" And I said, "Well, sure." So he and Sister Faust and Brother and Sister Wright came. We were struggling so much with these bronzes, and I'd asked these people to do this. I knew how much danger we were in. I knew if one of those guys slipped, somebody was going to get burned beyond recognition. I knew if somebody slipped with the wax, that would happen. We had the whole stake praying morning and night for the safety of those who were fooling with this bronze stuff, so that they would be protected and that they would be successful. I felt inadequate. I felt everything you could feel. President Faust came and I said, "President, I'm going to take you somewhere." And I took him over to this guy's house where we're doing the bronzes. The guy was there with his wife. They were really kind of discouraged. We had wasted hundreds of pounds of bronze. It was costing a lot of money to do what we were doing. President Faust went in there. He looked at what we were doing. He looked at all the broken shells. He looked at the destroyed bronze. He went over and he put his arm around Brother Fabricius. And he said, "Brother Braun, I promise you this will work and they will be perfect in every way." That gave us the courage. We'd never been around an apostle before. If an apostle told us it would work, it would work. We had 9 more failures. 3 days before the dedication, we had ruined our last mold. We didn't have any more. Brother Fabricius asked me if I would go home and make 2 more molds of each one. There's 4 in all. There's this one and 3 more. I said I would. He said if I would, he thought that he could get 6 more pours. I went home, got my daughters out of bed at midnight and said, "We've got to make these waxes." We started making waxes. They finished touching up the first set at about 2:30 a.m. I sent them to bed. I went to bed, and my wife and I said our companion prayers. And in the prayer, I pled with the Lord. I said, "Father in heaven, people of this stake have done anything I've asked them to do. All we want to do is make something to commemorate the Martin and the Willie people. Not us, but them. We've done everything we can do. We need some intervention, even if an angel needs to be sent to hold those things together. At the conclusion of the prayer, my wife and I were both in tears. We went to bed. I got up at 5 a.m. because we had to trim the edges off the molds. To do that, I had a Bunsen burner and a mason trowel. I'd heat the trowel and then cut those off. I couldn't get the Bunsen burner to light, so I changed it and put on a brand new tank of gas. Tried to light it again, and it wouldn't light. I was exhausted. I was tired. And I took that can of gas and I threw it across the garage. And the minute it left my hand, the thought came into my mind. You ask for an angel. Where is your faith? I went back in and told my wife we didn't need a backup. We needed 4 waxes. We had them, and that's all we needed. The workers came at 7 o'clock to get the waxes, and they said, where is the second set? I'd already gone to work, and my wife said, you don't need a second set. The workers said, who said that? And she said, my husband. And they said, was it a real tired Scott Lormer or was it the stake president? And she said, I've lived with him long enough to know that it was the stake president. Those are the only ones we used. The next day we cast the first one. I was there when it happened. I saw it with my own eyes. I asked Ron before we lifted up the doors of the oven. I said, Ron, what are you going to do if it's broken? He said, I'll throw it on the ground and break it into 1,000,000 pieces. I said, I agree. We can't afford any more bronze. We lifted the doors to the oven, and those are the most beautiful things. They're crystal white. It's the most white you've ever seen. And then on the inside of them, where the wax used to be, it glows red. It's gorgeous. When we opened that up and he reached in and grabbed it, I saw it, and Brother Stark saw it, and Brother Fabricius saw it. There was a crack across the back of that plaque, clear from one corner to the other. I said, Ron, it's broken. He acted as though he hadn't heard me. I yelled at him again, Ron, it's broken. He walked over and laid it down, and he said, pour the bronze. I said, Ron, it's broken. He said, pour the bronze. We poured the bronze. It's impossible what happened. The bronze came up, bubbling up through that crack, but it never broke the shell. That bronze is perfect in every way, except for on the back side of it, there is a crack cast in bronze across the complete back side of that bronze. Couldn't have happened, but it did. Then we had another problem. We had all the bronzes for the monuments. We then had some real ugly looking stuff. I don't know if you've ever seen raw bronze, but it's ugly. It's a real weird color. We thought that it would just come out of there looking like the ones that you see, with a black background and the letters shiny. It was ugly. We didn't want to put it on the monuments. So we said, how do you get that black like that? And nobody knew anything about patina. We do now, but we didn't then. So Brother Stark says, I got to figure it out. He says, don't worry about it. I'll make them black. So what are you going to do? He got this big cutting torch out, got a big flame on it, and he heated up the backside of that bronze. Warped it. But he had a 2-ton press to make it go flat again, so it was all right, but he warped it. Then he went over and he got the crankcase oil out of a truck. And he came back and poured that dirty oil all over our beautiful bronze. And what had happened was, when he heated it, the pores of that metal opened up just enough to let that dirty, junky oil inside. Then when it cooled, it trapped it. And those plaques are black as black to this day. Then we just took a grinder and ground off the front of the letters so that you could read them. Those plaques were put on that night and the next night. Bishop Gary Anderson and others finished the last one at Rocky Ridge at 8 a.m. on August 15th, and they were dedicated at noon on August 15th.
For some must push and some must pull as we go marching up the hill. So merrily on the way we go until we reach the valley. Oh.
The last part of it is what you're going to see tomorrow. And that is, I told the stake what President Hinckley told me, that not only did we have to get the temple work done and build the monuments, but we had to acquire the land, which was an impossible thing to do. Tomorrow when you see it, you might agree that it was impossible. We acquired part of the third largest ranch in the United States. We acquired 112,000 acres. That's pristine. It's the way the pioneers saw it. It's an unbelievable story all by itself. The acquisition of Rock Creek. I told the people of the stake, I said, as your stake president, I promise you that if we will finish this temple work, we will then become the stewards of not only the Willie but the Martin lands. The last temple ordinance was done, interestingly enough, for Captain James Gray Willie. He was the last one that needed an ordinance done. He wasn't sealed to his third wife. We did that ordinance on September 6th, 1992. And on September 10th, we owned Rock Creek. It was just a given that it was going to happen. President Hinckley, when he was here on August 15th of 1992, we took him first to Martin's Cove. And he told me then, as President Faust did earlier in July, he said, President Lorimer, get an easement across the Sun Ranch into Martin's Cove. He said, do that for the church. Then we went from there to the Willie Rescue Site, had the dedication there, went up over Rocky Ridge, and then took him onto Rock Creek. President Faust, when he was here in July, was like a little boy. He so wanted to go onto Rock Creek, but the landowner wouldn't let us take him on. I'll never forget that mental picture in my mind of President James E. Faust standing at that fence, wanting to go over to the monument, but not being able to. President Faust has been back many times since, but that day we couldn't take him there. August 15th came and the landowner softened his heart and let us take President Hinckley onto the property. We drove him in there. When we got there, we told him the stories about it and everything, and then he went back to get in the Suburban, and we have a tradition in our stake that we place little bouquets of flowers by different ones of the pioneers' names. And I'd pick 2 or 3 little flowers and put them down next to Bo Dio Mortensen's name. And I heard that voice, you know, it's so distinguishable. President Lorimer, you can't get away with that. I thought, oh, geez, what do I do? You know, I just put the flowers down. Here comes President Hinckley. And he's ripping flowers out of the ground. I mean, he didn't pick a few. He ripped a bouquet of flowers. I mean, big bouquet of flowers. And then he knelt down at that monument. And he placed those flowers next to Bo Dio's name. And with tears in his eyes, he stood up and he said, "She's my friend too." Here's a little Danish girl who was traveling alone, who didn't understand the language, was 9 years old, was lost for 135 years, and a prophet of God knelt down and gave her a bouquet of flowers. Unbelievable experience. He then grabbed me by the arm and said, "Come with me." We walked down Rock Creek for a ways, and he said, "I don't care what you have to pay. Buy this for the church." I went on September 10th and sat down on a rock with the man that owned it. We talked about the weather. We talked about cowboy stories. Finally, I said, "Kenny, you need to sell this to the church." He said, "Yeah, I know, but you won't pay me enough." I said, "We won't pay enough because you want too much." But I knew President Hinckley let me pay whatever I had to get it. I said, "Kenny, you want way too much for this land." He said, "No, I don't. It's a fair price." I said, "It is not." I said, "I'll make you a firm offer right now." He said, "Okay, what is it?" I said, "I will pay you 25% of what you want." He looked at me and said, "It's a deal." And we owned Rock Creek. It was that simple. But we had to first do the temple work. Once the temple work was done, then the Willie and the Martin people said, if our story can help other people, and if the lands where we suffered so much can be of testimony building experience for others, we'll help you get the land. It was just as easy as that we got Rock Creek. Sun Ranch is a whole different episode, a whole different set of circumstances. Sun Ranch was owned by Tom de Beausoleil. He was a Frenchman, French-Canadian from, I can't remember where he's from, but he's Canadian descent anyway. And he just really liked the Sweetwater Valley. So he set up a homestead there and built his first cabin in 1873, I think it was, and began living there, married and had children. And the Sun family had been there ever since. It was the oldest water right west of the Mississippi held by one family. It was also the third largest ranch in the United States. It was 1,200,000 acres. The Suns would not allow people into Martin's Cove unless you just happened to know one of them, and then they would. I knew Dennis' son, who was the foreman on the ranch, and he would let me in there anytime I wanted to go and allowed us to build the monument. President Hinckley went in and dedicated it and met Bernard's son, who was the patriarch of the Sun family. Asked me to negotiate with Bernard an easement into Martin's Cove, as did President Faust. I spent the winter of 1993. We'd bought Rock Creek in 92, in the fall of 92, so I spent the whole winter of 1993 negotiating with the Suns to have an easement across the land into Martin's Cove. And I got it done. So I wrote President Hinckley and said, "Got it done, here's the deal." I never heard from him. So I thought, well, President Faust asked me, I'll write him. So I wrote President Faust, said, "Here's the deal." And I didn't hear from him. So I thought, well, maybe they don't want it anymore. We're busy. We had, when you see Rock Creek tomorrow, we had, in the summer of 1994, we had more fun than you should have. Or 93, we were up there with D9 cats and all kinds of junk. There was tailings from mining operations. We had to level all those, and we had to seed the grass and plant wildflowers. And we had our stake up there all the time doing this stuff. It was great fun. So we were busy doing that, so we just didn't work on Martin's Cove. 1994 came, and President Hinckley called and asked if he could come to the Rock Creek dedication. I said, "Sure, you can not only come if you want, you can dedicate the thing." So he came in 1994, July 23rd, and after the dedication, there's a mob of people there. He grabbed me by the arm and he said, "Come with me." And he had me on one side of him and Dave Sayre on the other side. So I'm walking with President over to his car. We get him in the car and close the door, and he rolled the window down about this far, and he looked right straight at me. He said, "Get in." It's the craziest thing's ever happened to me. What do you mean, get in? He said, get in. I said, where are we going? He said, I'm going back to Salt Lake. I said, well, how am I going to get back here? He said, oh, we'll let you off on the road somewhere. And I said, yeah, but how do I get back? He said, just give your counselors your keys and have them follow us. So I threw my keys to my counselors. I said, I'm going with him. You guys follow me, and we'll see what happens. So we go down the road, and we talked about all kinds of things. Talked about my kids, talked about the weather, talked about Rock Creek, talked about the pioneers. Finally, the conversation turned to Martin's Cove. And the president said, how's the easement into Martin's Cove coming? I said, it's not doing very well at all. And I said, President Hinckley, I think we should just forget it. He sat up in his seat and he turned around and he looked at me and he said, I would believe that from anybody in the church, but not you. I said, well, I mean it with all my heart. You should just forget it. He said, why? I said, because since it's been in the church news so many times, every carload of Mormons that comes by wants to go to Martin's Cove. These guys are trying to earn a living. These carloads come by and say, we want to go to Martin's Cove, and they have to get off their horse or out from underneath their tractor or off their baler, or the Mormons leave the fences open and the bulls get in with the heifers and they spin their tires in the pasture. I said, it's a mess. We're causing a real problem for these people. And he said, man, he said, that is terrible. I said, yeah, we ought to just forget it. So he sat back down in his seat, and it got really, really quiet in the car. And I thought, man, they're just going to throw me out. And then I said, President, I got another idea if you want to hear it. And he said, what's that? I said, let's just buy the whole ranch. He sat up, turned around, looked at me, and said, I really don't believe you said that. I said, we need it. He said, what for? He said, why would we want a ranch in Wyoming? I said, President, you buy ranches in Wyoming all the time. He said, how do you know that? I said, because you just bought one in Manchester. How do you know that? I never told him, but my senior high councilman was the lawyer that did all the work on it. And I said, well, you know, let's just buy the ranch. He said, how big is it? I said, I don't know. It's big. I said, but it'd be terrific. It's amazing how many people come there in the winter. They want to see what it was like in the winter. It's awesome in the winter. You can almost see them. You know, when you go in there and you're all alone, it's really something to be in there in the winter. Anyway, I said, it'd be open 12 months a year. I said, it'd be the only visitor center in the church that pay for itself, because it's not only a visitor center and a group of historical sites, it's a ranch. These people have made a living there since 1860. I said, it's great, let's do it. He said, you know, he said, I kind of like the way you're thinking. He says, you're authorized on behalf of the church to go buy that ranch. I said, wait a minute, not me. You know, send somebody else. I don't know how to buy a ranch. I don't know nothing about a ranch. He said, no, go ahead and do it. And told Dave to drop my brother Sarah to pull over to the side of the road, and they let me out on the side of the road. And he rolled the window down, he shook my hand, he said, good luck. He said, the only thing is that it's between you and me. He said, don't tell a lot of people what we're doing. He said, let me know how you're coming. I said, okay. So he drove off. And my counselors came and picked me up, and I guess I was a little pale about the color of my shirt. And President Kitchen said, what happened? I said, oh, nothing. He said, well, are we in trouble? And I said, you guys aren't in any trouble, but I'm in more trouble than you can imagine. He said, well, did something go wrong at the dedication or something? I said, no, everything went fine at the dedication, but I'm supposed to do something, and I can't tell you what it is I'm doing. How do you buy a ranch from somebody who doesn't want to sell it, who it's their family heirloom, you know? I mean, how do you do that? I didn't know how to do it, so I did the only thing I could do. I wore the carpet out next to my bed, praying about it. I prayed about it all the time. How do I do this? The prophets give me an assignment. How do I do this? It didn't take long, so I didn't really wear the carpet out. 2 weeks later, 2 weeks to the day, almost to the hour, I was at Martin's Cove. The Arvada, Colorado stake had come up, and they asked me to speak to them, so I was over there speaking to them. Bernard's son, whenever he found out that I was on the property, he'd come tell me all the bad things the Mormons had done. About the bulls with the heifers and all this stuff. And so I kind of hid every time I went over there, and Bernard always found me. This time Bernard knew I was out there, and you could always tell how mad Bernard was because how fast he was driving. He drives this old mustard-colored Jeep Wagoneer, and if he's driving fast, you know something's really bad wrong. He has this old cigar that hangs out of his mouth, and he chews it. He never smokes it, just chews it. And he's chewing on a cigar. He came roaring up, slammed on the brakes, rocks flying everywhere. He gets out. He's 80. At that time, I think he was 78. Gets out of the car. He's a pretty spry guy. He's a real Wyoming cowboy. He comes over to me, and he just pokes me in the chest. Just, boom. Hi, Bernard. And I wanted to say, those CES guys, I don't know anything about them. He said, you and me have got to have a talk, Scotty. And I said, what about? And he said, come with me. So we walked down the road. We met maybe a half a mile. Bernard didn't say a word. Didn't say nothing. Which wasn't unusual for Bernard because he doesn't talk much. But I looked over at him, and these big tears were coming down his face. His face looks like a piece of leather. I mean, he's just a real Wyoming cowboy. He's lived there all his life. Been out in the sun every day of his life, herding cows. And these tears were coming down his face, and my first thought was, oh my word, the guy's got cancer. He's dying or something. So I said, Bernard, what in the world's wrong? He said, the boys threw me out. I said, what boys threw you out? What are you talking about, Bernard? He said, I no longer am the president of Sunland and Cattle as of last Friday. Do you know anyone who would like to buy this ranch? 14 days from the time the prophet told me to go buy. He wasn't the prophet then, but President Hinckley. 14 days, the guy that owned and controlled the ranch came to me and asked me if I knew anybody that wanted to buy the ranch. I said, Bernard, I do. Let me get back to you. So I called President Hinckley. He couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. So President Hinckley got John Creer involved, who's over farm management, and John did a very, very good job. John did an excellent job of negotiating the purchase of the ranch. A lot of give and take went on. It took 1 year to divide the ranch. The family was having troubles between different sections of the family. Finally, Steve's son and Bernard's son decided to get in a room and flip a coin. And whoever won the coin toss got to decide how to draw the line or to pick first. I don't know who won the coin toss, but I know who drew the line. It was Bernard. Bernard couldn't have drawn that line better if he'd have been the Angel Moroni. He could have drawn that line east-west, northwest, east-west. He could have done a lot of things. 1,200,000 acres, you can do a lot of line drawing. Bernard put everything we wanted on one side of the line. It also is only 10% of the whole ranch, but it includes 90% of the deeded land and carries 60% of the cattle. It's the plum of the whole thing. I was there the day they did it. I wasn't in the room, but I was there. They came out of the room giggling. Dennis son did. He says, you'll never believe what happened. I said, no, what happened? He said, Bernard doesn't own what you want anymore. I said, who does? He said, Steve. I said, who is Steve's son? Nobody in the church knew Steve's son. He lived clear down by Rollins, and none of us knew him. All of a sudden, there's a new player in the game, and we were going to have to start all over again. How do you meet this guy now? Went back to my knees and started praying about it. My boss is a big entrepreneur. He loves to raise money for silly things like companies. And there's a guy from Long Island, New York that wanted to come out to Wyoming and build a buffalo herd, if you can believe that, out of scrap iron. And he wanted to put it out in the prairie and have it in the shape of a buffalo. And then these things would stand on one foot and pivot in the wind as they blew them, and they'd make groaning sounds like buffaloes. And it was going to be a new Mount Rushmore, you know. And my boss gets involved in this goofy thing, and since I'm the chief financial officer, wants me to raise the money for this guy to build this stupid buffalo herd. It's the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. But I'm flying back and forth to Long Island trying to raise this $15 million to build these dumb buffalo. And the guy can't find a piece of ground to put them on. So he hears about the Sun Ranch and goes and talks to Steve's son. Unbeknownst to me, one day I come to work and there's 3 guys in my office. One of them's the artist, the guy from New York. One of them's Dennis' son, who I know very well, and this other guy that I don't know. I go in, and Dennis' son stands up and says, I want you to meet my cousin, Steve. All of a sudden, the guy that we needed to meet to buy the ranch from is in my office in Riverton, Wyoming, 100 miles from his home. He's in my office, and I'm trying to raise money to build him a buffalo herd. It's crazy what was going on. The buffalo herd failed miserably. It was a wipeout. Never built the buffalo herd. But we became friends with Steve on a business basis. Started saying, Steve, what about, maybe want to sell this thing? Well, yeah, we'd consider it if the deal was right. Got John Creer involved again, started making the deal. It was going real good. December 1996 comes along, and I'm in New York again, on Wall Street, in a limousine, with nothing to do, waiting for a meeting. So I said, I'll call Steve and see how it's going. Called Steve's son. Steve, how's it going? Where are you? I'm in Wall Street in a limousine. You're not either. Yeah, I really am. How's the deal on the ranch? The deal's off. What do you mean the deal's off? You guys are pushing too hard a bargain. We're not going to sell. Ever. I said, Steve, wait a minute. We've all put in too much time. It's good for you, it's good for your family, and it's good for the church. He said, we're not selling. I said, Steve, what about the easement into Martin's Cove? He said, you will never own an easement across Sunland. Started to fly home that afternoon. We have a Citation jet. We're all pilots. And that day I was flying co-pilot. People don't like to fly with me because I don't navigate very well. So they don't let me be the pilot. There's 2 kinds of ratings. There's VFR, which is visual flight rated, and IFR, which is instrument flight rated. That's what I am, but it doesn't stand for instrument flight rated. It stands for I follow roads. I can't navigate at all, and I get vertigo real bad. So they don't like me flying, but they let me fly co-pilot once in a while, and so I was flying co-pilot that day on the way back from New York, and we got out over Casper somewhere, and I asked the pilot if I could fly for a minute, and he said, sure. So I took our jet from about 43,000 feet down to about 600 feet above the ground, and we were doing about 360 miles an hour, and we buzzed Independence Rock, Devil's Gate, the Martin's Cove, the Sun Ranch, Split Rock, the Willie Rescue Site, Rocky Ridge, Rock Creek. And by the time I got that thing turned around, we were clear down at Pacific Springs. It took us 2.5 minutes. But as we flew by, thousands and thousands of memories just came to my memory of the Willie and the Martin people, of our people, of you, of the people who would come if we had that as an asset for the church. I've never written President Hinckley or any of the rest of them a letter unless they wrote me first, and I responded. That time, I broke that rule, and I wrote President a letter. It was a long letter. I told him why we had to have the ranch. I told him we had to somehow put the deal back together. We really needed the ranch. After he got it, he called me and he said, you wax pretty eloquent when you get upset. I said, I'm not upset. We just need it. He said, go over and see if you can put it back together. I called Steve, met him at Muddy Gap, 7 o'clock in the morning. Figured I'd be there for a half an hour. I was there for 13. Steve asked me if I'd get in his truck. This was December 1976. So I got in his truck. We drove all over that ranch. Went to the top of the Ferris Haggerty Mountains, went clear back over to Savage Pocket, went all over everywhere. We talked and talked and talked. He said, we can't sell the ranch. I said, why? He said, I don't want you to think I'm nuts. He said, but sometimes when I'm out here, I hear voices. I said, you do? He said, it's not like you and me talking to each other. He said, but I hear a voice. I said, well, who is it? He said, I not only can tell you who it is, but I can tell you what he's saying. He said, it's my great-grandfather, Thomas Son Sr. And he said, you know, he was kind of a mean guy. He hung cattle, Kate, and some other things. And he said, I don't want to get on the other side of the veil, or on the other side, he said, when I die, and have him mad at me. And he said, Tom Son's telling me, don't you ever sell this ranch. It's our blood, sweat, and tears. It's our heritage. It's our home. And don't you ever sell it. He said, so I can't sell. So we drove some more. He said, there's other times that I hear hundreds of voices. I said, well, who are they? He said, it's no question about it. It's the Martin people. He said, they say they know my grandfather and that it's okay, that the church will take care of our name and preserve our heritage as well as your own. He said, is that true? And I said, Steve, as long as I'm alive and have anything to do with it, it will be the Sun Ranch. We will preserve your heritage if I have anything to say about it. Other times in the day, he said interesting things. I said, Steve, you know, we're looking at this as an investment. If I could show the church, I was thinking as an accountant, if I could show the church that we could make more money on it and we could get our investment back quicker, maybe that would help me sell the deal to the church. He said, you can't. I said, what do you mean I can't? He said, there's no alfalfa out here. I said, we've driven all day long, and I've not seen one alfalfa plant. He said, and you never will. I said, why? He said, every ranch out here has alfalfa. Why doesn't yours have alfalfa? It's a better cash crop. He said, you will never see one single plant of alfalfa on Sun land. But why? He says, my great-grandfather. So what's your great-grandfather got to do with alfalfa? He said, before my great-grandfather died, he called my great-grandfather in and said, don't you ever plow this land. If you don't, you will never need to. I said, what does that mean, Steve? He said, this ranch supports 20% more cattle per acre than any ranch in the area. He said, because of the second thing my great-grandfather said. So what's that? He said to plow up the Mormon Trail would be sacrilegious. Don't you ever plow it up. So what you see there is what the pioneers saw. It hasn't changed a bit. Economics has not driven that ranch in the way that it's driven every other ranch. They've all had to convert to alfalfa, except Sunlands. And on Sunlands, there is only native grass. But yet it supports 20% more cattle than any ranch in central Wyoming. At the end of that day with Steve, or in the middle of the day, we were up on top of the Ferris Mountains. He asked me if I wanted something to drink. I said, Steve, I'd love something to drink. I didn't bring anything to eat or anything, and neither did he, because we thought we'd just not be able to make a deal. He got in the back of the truck, and he got in his cooler, and he got 2 cans of Coca-Cola, and he gave me one. And I know there's a debate that goes on in the church whether you should or you shouldn't, and I'm not here to debate that. There is one doctrine, though, that is unquestionable in the church, and that is you have to do what your mother tells you. And my mother taught me from the time I was a little boy to never drink cola drinks. And so I never have. I don't know what they taste like to this day. When he gave me that can of Coke, and I could see that it was cold, I was thirsty because I'd been talking a long time. I really, really wanted to drink that. But I didn't because of my mother. I set it in the seat next to me, and we finished the day. 13 hours from the time he picked me up, he let me out at Muddy Gap. As I got out of his big old truck, my coat slid across the seat, and the can of Coke had been covered up by my coat, and he saw the can of Coca-Cola sitting in the seat. And he said, "Hey, you didn't drink that Coke I gave you." I said, "Yeah, I know, I didn't." The most profound thing he said to me personally that day was what he said next. He said, "Good. I can trust you. You practice what you believe." And I don't know if that little 50-cent can of Coca-Cola had anything to do with anything, but 3 weeks later, the church owned the Sun Ranch and became steward of those lands. It's so big. When you're there, you can stand there, and everything you see, we own. You can have Girls Camp and Boy Scout camp there at the same time and not have any problems. They can't get to each other. It is huge. And we've become the stewards because of what happened there, and that's the sacrifice of the Martin people.
For some must push and some must pull as we go marching up the hill. So merrily on the way we go until we reach the valley. Oh.
The last part of it is what you're going to see tomorrow. And that is, I told the stake what President Hinckley told me, that not only did we have to get the temple work done and build the monuments, but we had to acquire the land, which was an impossible thing to do. Tomorrow when you see it, you might agree that it was impossible. We acquired part of the third largest ranch in the United States. We acquired 112,000 acres. That's pristine. It's the way the pioneers saw it. It's an unbelievable story all by itself. The acquisition of Rock Creek. I told the people of the stake, I said, as your stake president, I promise you that if we will finish this temple work, we will then become the stewards of not only the Willie but the Martin lands. The last temple ordinance was done, interestingly enough, for Captain James Gray Willie. He was the last one that needed an ordinance done. He wasn't sealed to his third wife. We did that ordinance on September 6th, 1992. And on September 10th, we owned Rock Creek. It was just a given that it was going to happen. President Hinckley, when he was here on August 15th of 1992, we took him first to Martin's Cove. And he told me then, as President Faust did earlier in July, he said, "President Lorimer, get an easement across the Sun Ranch into Martin's Cove." He said, "Do that for the church." Then we went from there to the Willie Rescue Site, had the dedication there, went up over Rocky Ridge, and then took him onto Rock Creek. President Faust, when he was here in July, was like a little boy. He so wanted to go onto Rock Creek, but the landowner wouldn't let us take him on. I'll never forget that mental picture in my mind of President James E. Faust standing at that fence, wanting to go over to the monument, but not being able to. President Faust has been back many times since, but that day we couldn't take him there. August 15th came and the landowner softened his heart and let us take President Hinckley onto the property. We drove him in there. When we got there, we told him the stories about it and everything, and then he went back to get in the Suburban, and we have a tradition in our stake that we place little bouquets of flowers by different ones of the pioneers' names. And I'd picked 2 or 3 little flowers and put them down next to Bodeo Mortensen's name. And I heard that voice, you know, it's so distinguishable. President Lorimer, you can't get away with that. I thought, oh, geez, what do I do? I just put the flowers down. Here comes President Hinckley. And he's ripping flowers out of the ground. I mean, he didn't pick a few. He ripped a bouquet of flowers. I mean, big bouquet of flowers. And then he knelt down at that monument, and he placed those flowers next to Bodile's name. And with tears in his eyes, he stood up and he said, "She's my friend too." Here's a little Danish girl who was traveling alone, who didn't understand the language, was 9 years old, was lost for 135 years, and a prophet of God knelt down and gave her a bouquet of flowers. Unbelievable experience. He then grabbed me by the arm and said, "Come with me." We walked down Rock Creek for a ways, and he said, "I don't care what you have to pay. Buy this for the church." I went on September 10th and sat down on a rock with the man that owned it. We talked about the weather. We talked about cowboy stories. Finally, I said, "Kenny, you need to sell this to the church." He said, "Yeah, I know, but you won't pay me enough." I said, "We won't pay you enough because you want too much." But I knew President Hinckley let me pay whatever I had to get it. I said, "Kenny, you want way too much for this land." He said, "No, I don't. It's a fair price." I said, "It is not." I said, "I'll make you a firm offer right now." He said, "Okay, what is it?" I said, "I will pay you 25% of what you want." He looked at me and he said, "It's a deal." And we owned Rock Creek. It was that simple. But we had to first do the temple work. Once the temple work was done, then the Willie and the Martin people said, if our story can help other people, and if the lands where we suffered so much can be of testimony building experience for others, we'll help you get the land. It was just as easy as that we got Rock Creek. Sun Ranch is a whole different episode, a whole different set of circumstances. Sun Ranch was owned by Tom de Beausoleil. He was a Frenchman, French-Canadian from, I can't remember where he's from, but he's Canadian descent anyway. And he just really liked Sweetwater Valley. So he set up a homestead there and built his first cabin in 1873, I think it was, and began living there, married and had children. And the Sun family had been there ever since. It was the oldest water right west of the Mississippi held by one family. It was also the third largest ranch in the United States. It was 1,200,000 acres. The Suns would not allow people into Martin's Cove unless you just happened to know one of them, and then they would. I knew Dennis' son, who was the foreman on the ranch, and he would let me in there anytime I wanted to go and allowed us to build the monument. President Hinckley went in and dedicated it and met Bernard's son, who was the patriarch of the Sun family. Asked me to negotiate with Bernard an easement into Martin's Cove, as did President Faust. I spent the winter of 1993. We'd bought Rock Creek in 92, in the fall of 92, so I spent the whole winter of 1993 negotiating with the Suns to have an easement across the land into Martin's Cove. And I got it done. So I wrote President Hinckley and said, "Got it done, here's the deal." I never heard from him. So I thought, well, President Faust asked me, I'll write him. So I wrote President Faust, said, "Here's the deal." And I didn't hear from him. So I thought, well, maybe they don't want it anymore. We're busy. We had, when you see Rock Creek tomorrow, we had, in the summer of 1994, we had more fun than you should have. Or 93, we were up there with D9 cats and all kinds of junk. There was tailings from mining operations. We had to level all those, and we had to seed the grass and plant wildflowers. And we had our stake up there all the time doing this stuff. It was great fun. So we were busy doing that, so we just didn't work on Martin's Cove. 1994 came, and President Hinckley called and asked if he could come to the Rock Creek dedication. I said, "Sure, you can not only come if you want, you can dedicate the thing." So he came in 1994, July 23rd, and After the dedication, there's a mob of people there. He grabbed me by the arm and he said, "Come with me." And he had me on one side of him and Dave Sayre on the other side. You know, so I'm walking with President over to his car. We get him in the car and close the door. And he rolled the window down about this far and he looked right straight at me. He said, "Get in." It's the craziest thing that's ever happened to me. What do you mean, get in? He said, "Get in." I said, "Where are we going?" He said, "I'm going back to Salt Lake." I said, "Well, how am I going to get back here?" He said, "Oh, we'll let you off on the road somewhere." And I said, "Yeah, but how do I get back?" He said, "Just give your counselors your keys and have them follow us." So I threw my keys to my counselors. I said, "I'm going with him. You guys follow me, and we'll see what happens." So we go down the road, and we talked about all kinds of things. Talked about my kids, talked about the weather, talked about Rock Creek, talked about the pioneers. Finally, the conversation turned to Martin's Cove. And the President said, "How's the easement into Martin's Cove coming?" I said, "It's not doing very well at all." And I said, "President Hinckley, I think we should just forget it." He sat up in his seat and he turned around and he looked at me and he said, "I would believe that from anybody in the church, but not you." I said, "Well, I mean it with all my heart. You should just forget it." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because since it's been in the church news so many times, every carload of Mormons that comes by wants to go to Martin's Cove. These guys are trying to earn a living. These carloads come by and say, 'We want to go to Martin's Cove,' and they have to get off their horse or out from underneath their tractor or off their baler, or the Mormons leave the fences open and the bulls get in with the heifers and they spin their tires in the pasture." I said, "It's a mess. We're causing a real problem for these people." And he said, "Man," he said, "that is terrible." I said, "Yeah, we ought to just forget it." So he sat back down in his seat and it got really, really quiet in the car. And I thought, man, they're just going to throw me out. And then I said, "President, I got another idea if you want to hear it." And he said, "What's that?" I said, "Let's just buy the whole ranch." He sat up, turned around, looked at me, and said, "I really don't believe you said that." I said, "We need it." He said, "What for?" He said, "Why would we want a ranch in Wyoming?" I said, "President, you buy ranches in Wyoming all the time." He said, "How do you know that?" I said, "Because you just bought one in Manchester." "How do you know that?" I never told him, but my senior high councilman was the lawyer that did all the work on it. And I said, "Well, you know, let's just buy the ranch." He said, "How big is it?" I said, "I don't know. It's big." I said, "But it'd be terrific." It's amazing how many people come there in the winter. They want to see what it was like in the winter. It's awesome in the winter. You can almost see them. You know, when you go in there and you're all alone, it's really something to be in there in the winter. Anyway, I said, "Be open 12 months a year." I said, "It'd be the only visitor center in the church that pay for itself." Because it's not only a visitor center and a group of historical sites, it's a ranch. These people have made a living there since 1860. I said, "It's great, let's do it." He said, "You know," he said, "I kind of like the way you're thinking." He says, "You're authorized on behalf of the church to go buy that ranch." I said, "Wait a minute, not me." You know, send somebody else. I don't know how to buy a ranch. I don't know nothing about a ranch. He said, "No, go ahead and do it." And told Dave to drop my brother Sayre to pull over to the side of the road, and they let me out on the side of the road. And he rolled the window down, he shook my hand, he said, "Good luck." He said, "The only thing is that it's between you and me." He said, "Don't tell a lot of people what we're doing." He said, "Let me know how you're coming." I said, "Okay." So he drove off. And my counselors came and picked me up, and I guess I was a little pale about the color of my shirt. And President Kitchen said, "What happened?" I said, "Oh, nothing." He said, "Well, are we in trouble?" And I said, "You guys aren't in any trouble, but I'm in more trouble than you can imagine." He said, "Well, did something go wrong at the dedication or something?" I said, "No, everything went fine at the dedication, but I'm supposed to do something, and I can't tell you what it is I'm doing." How do you buy a ranch from somebody who doesn't want to sell it, who it's their family heirloom, you know? I mean, how do you do that? I didn't know how to do it, so I did the only thing I could do. I wore the carpet out next to my bed, praying about it. I Prayed about it all the time. How do I do this? The prophet's given me an assignment. How do I do this? It didn't take long, so I didn't really wear the carpet out. 2 weeks later, 2 weeks to the day, almost to the hour, I was at Martin's Cove. The Arvada, Colorado stake had come up, and they asked me to speak to him, so I was over there speaking to him. Bernard's son, whenever he found out that I was on the property, he'd come tell me all the bad things the Mormons had done. About the bulls with the heifers and all this stuff. And so I kind of hid every time I went over there, and Bernard always found me. And this time Bernard knew I was out there, and you could always tell how mad Bernard was because how fast he was driving. He drives this old mustard-colored Jeep Wagoneer, and if he's driving fast, you know something's really bad wrong. He has this old cigar that hangs out of his mouth, and he chews it. He never smokes it, just chews it. And he's chewing on a cigar. He came roaring up, slammed on the brakes, rocks flying everywhere. He gets out. He's 80. At that time, I think he was 78. Gets out of the car. He's a pretty spry guy. He's a real Wyoming cowboy. He comes over to me, and he just pokes me in the chest. Just, boom. Hi, Bernard, And I wanted to say, those CES guys, I don't know anything about them. He said, you and me have got to have a talk, Scotty. And I said, what about? He said, come with me. So we walked down the road. We met maybe a half a mile. Bernard didn't say a word. Didn't say nothing. Which wasn't unusual for Bernard because he doesn't talk much. But I looked over at him, and these big tears were coming down his face. His face looks like a piece of leather. I mean, he's just a real Wyoming cowboy. He's lived there all his life. Been out in the sun every day of his life, herding cows. And these tears were coming down his face, and my first thought was, oh my word, the guy's got cancer. He's dying or something. So I said, Bernard, what in the world's wrong? He said, the boys threw me out. I said, what boys threw you out? What are you talking about, Bernard? He said, I no longer am the president of Sun, Land, and Cattle as of last Friday. Do you know anyone who would like to buy this ranch? 14 days from the time the prophet told me to go buy. He wasn't the prophet then, but President Hinckley. 14 days, the guy that owned and controlled the ranch came to me and asked me if I knew anybody who wanted to buy the ranch. I said, Bernard, I do. Let me get back to you. So I called President Hinckley. He couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. So President Hinckley got John Creer involved, who's over farm management, and John did a very, very good job. John did an excellent job of negotiating the purchase of the ranch. A lot of give and take went on. It took 1 year to divide the ranch. The family was having troubles between different sections of the family. Finally, Steve's son and Bernard's son decided to get in a room and flip a coin. And whoever won the coin toss got to decide how to draw the line or to pick first. I don't know who won the coin toss, but I know who drew the line. It was Bernard. Bernard couldn't have drawn that line better if he'd have been the Angel Moroni. He could have drawn that line east-west, northwest, east-west. He could have done a lot of things. 1,200,000 acres, you can do a lot of line drawing. Bernard put everything we wanted on one side of the line. It also is only 10% of the whole ranch, but it includes 90% of the deeded land and carries 60% of the cattle. It's the plum of the whole thing. I was there the day they did it. I wasn't in the room, but I was there. They came out of the room giggling. Dennis son did. He says, you'll never believe what happened. I said, no, what happened? He said, Bernard doesn't own what you want anymore. I said, who does? He said, Steve. I said, who is Steve's son? Nobody in the church knew Steve's son. He lived clear down by Rollins, and none of us knew him. All of a sudden, there's a new player in the game, and we were going to have to start all over again. How do you meet this guy now? Went back to my knees and started praying about it. My boss is a big entrepreneur. He loves to raise money for silly things like companies. And There was a guy from Long Island, New York that wanted to come out to Wyoming and build a buffalo herd, if you can believe that, out of scrap iron. And he wanted to put it out in the prairie and have it in the shape of a buffalo, and then these things would stand on one foot and pivot in the wind as they blew them, and they'd make groaning sounds like buffaloes. And it was going to be a new Mount Rushmore, you know. And my boss gets involved in this goofy thing, and since I'm the chief financial officer, wants me to raise the money for this guy to build this stupid buffalo herd. It's the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. But I'm flying back and forth to Long Island trying to raise this $15 million to build these dumb buffalo. And the guy can't find a piece of ground to put them on. So he hears about the Sun Ranch and goes and talks to Steve's son. Unbeknownst to me, one day I come to work and there's 3 guys in my office. One of them's the artist, the guy from New York. One of them's Dennis' son, who I know very well, and this other guy that I don't know. I go in and Dennis' son stands up and says, "I want you to meet my cousin, Steve." All of a sudden, the guy that we needed to meet to buy the ranch from is in my office in Riverton, Wyoming, 100 miles from his home. He's in my office, and I'm trying to raise money to build him a buffalo herd. It's crazy what was going on. The buffalo herd failed miserably. It was a wipeout. Never built the buffalo herd. But we became friends with Steve on a business basis. Started saying, "Steve, you know, what about, you know, maybe want to sell this thing?" "Well, yeah, we'd consider it if the deal was right." Got John Creer involved again, started making the deal. It was going real good. December 1996 comes along, and I'm in New York again, on Wall Street, in a limousine, with nothing to do, waiting for a meeting. So I said, I'll call Steve and see how it's going. Called Steve's son. "Steve, how's it going?" "Where are you?" "I'm in Wall Street in a limousine." "You're not either." "Yeah, I really am." "How's the deal on the ranch?" "The deal's off." "What do you mean the deal's off?" "You guys are pushing too hard a bargain. We're not going to sell. Ever." I said, "Steve, wait a minute. We've all put in too much time. It's good for you, it's good for your family, and it's good for the church." He said, "We're not selling." I said, "Steve, what about the easement into Martin's Cove?" He said, "You will never own an easement across Sun land." Started to fly home that afternoon. We have a Citation jet. We're all pilots, and that day I was flying co-pilot. People don't like to fly with me because I don't navigate very well. So they don't let me be the pilot. You know, there's 2 kinds of ratings. There's VFR, which is visual flight rated, and IFR, which is instrument flight rated. That's what I am, but it doesn't stand for instrument flight rated. It stands for I follow roads. I can't navigate at all, and I get vertigo real bad. So they don't like me flying, but they let me fly co-pilot once in a while, and so I was flying co-pilot that day on the way back from New York, and we got out over Casper somewhere, and I asked the pilot if I could fly for a minute, and he said, "Sure." So I took our jet from about 43,000 feet down to about 600 feet above the ground, and we were doing about 360 miles an hour. And we buzzed Independence Rock, Devil's Gate, the Martin's Cove, the Sun Ranch, Split Rock, the Willie Rescue Site, Rocky Ridge, Rock Creek. And by the time I got that thing turned around, we were clear down at Pacific Springs. It took us 2.5 minutes. But as we flew by, thousands and thousands of memories just came to my memory of the Willie and the Martin people, of our people, of you, of the people who would come if we had that as an asset for the church. I've never written President Hinckley or any of the rest of them a letter unless they wrote me first, and I responded. That time, I broke that rule, and I wrote President a letter. It was a long letter. I told him why we had to have the ranch. I told him we had to somehow put the deal back together. We really needed the ranch. After he got it, he called me and he said, "You know, you wax pretty eloquent when you get upset." I said, "I'm not upset. We just need it." He said, "Go over and see if you can put it back together." I called Steve, met him at Muddy Gap, 7 o'clock in the morning. Figured I'd be there for a half an hour. I was there for 13. Steve asked me if I'd get in his truck. This was December 1976. So I got in his truck. We drove all over that ranch. Went to the top of the Ferris Haggerty Mountains, went clear back over to Savage Pocket, went all over everywhere. We talked and talked and talked. He said, we can't sell the ranch. I said, why? He said, I don't want you to think I'm nuts. He said, but sometimes when I'm out here, I hear voices. I said, you do? He said, it's not like you and me talking to each other. He said, but I hear a voice. I said, well, who is it? He said, I not only can tell you who it is, but I can tell you what he's saying. He said, it's my great-grandfather, Thomas Son Sr. And he said, you know, he was kind of a mean guy. He hung cattle, Kate, and some other things. And he said, I don't want to get on the other side of the veil, or on the other side, he said, when I die, and have him mad at me. And he said, Tom Son's telling me, don't you ever sell this ranch. It's our blood, sweat, and tears. It's our heritage. It's our home. And don't you ever sell it. He said, so I can't sell. So we drove some more. He said, there's other times that I hear hundreds of voices. I said, well, who are they? He said, it's no question about it. It's the Martin people. He said, they say they know my grandfather and that it's okay, that the church will take care of our name and preserve our heritage as well as your own. He said, is that true? And I said, Steve, as long as I'm alive and have anything to do with it, it will be the Sun Ranch. We will preserve your heritage if I have anything to say about it. Other times in the day, he said interesting things. I said, Steve, you know, we're looking at this as an investment. If I could show the church, I was thinking as an accountant, if I could show the church that we could make more money on it and we could get our investment back quicker, maybe that'd help me sell the deal to the church. He said, you can't. I said, what do you mean I can't? He said, there's no alfalfa out here. I said, we've driven all day long, and I've not seen one alfalfa plant. He said, and you never will. I said, why? He said, every ranch out here has alfalfa. Why doesn't yours have alfalfa? It's a better cash crop. He said, you will never see one single plant of alfalfa on Sun land. But why? He says, my great-grandfather. So what's your great-grandfather got to do with alfalfa? He said, before my great-grandfather died, he called my great-grandfather in and said, don't you ever plow this land. If you don't, you will never need to. I said, what does that mean, Steve? He said, this ranch supports 20% more cattle per acre than any ranch in the area. He said, because of the second thing my great-grandfather said. So what's that? He said to plow up the Mormon Trail would be sacrilegious. Don't you ever plow it up. So what you see there is what the pioneers saw. It hasn't changed a bit. Economics has not driven that ranch in the way that it's driven every other ranch. They've all had to convert to alfalfa, except Sunlands. And on Sunlands, there is only native grass. But yet it supports 20% more cattle than any ranch in central Wyoming. At the end of that day with Steve, or in the middle of the day, we were up on top of the Ferris Mountains. He asked me if I wanted something to drink. I said, Steve, I'd love something to drink. I didn't bring anything to eat or anything, and neither did he, because we thought we'd just not be able to make a deal. He got in the back of the truck, and he got in his cooler, and he got 2 cans of Coca-Cola, and he gave me one. And I know there's a debate that goes on in the church whether you should or you shouldn't, and I'm not here to debate that. There is one doctrine, though, that is unquestionable in the church, And that is, you have to do what your mother tells you. And my mother taught me from the time I was a little boy to never drink cola drinks. And so I never have. I don't know what they taste like to this day. When he gave me that can of Coke, and I could see that it was cold, I was thirsty because I've been talking a long time. I really, really wanted to drink that. But I didn't because of my mother. I set it in the seat next to me, and we finished the day. 13 hours from the time he picked me up, he let me out at Muddy Gap. As I got out of his big old truck, my coat slid across the seat, and the can of Coke had been covered up by my coat, and he saw the can of Coca-Cola sitting in the seat. And he said, "Hey, you didn't drink that Coke I gave you." I said, "Yeah, I know, I didn't." The most profound thing he said to me personally that day was what he said next. He said, "Good. I can trust you. You practice what you believe." And I don't know if that little 50-cent can of Coca-Cola had anything to do with anything. But 3 weeks later, the church owned the Sun Ranch and became steward of those lands. It's so big. When you're there, you can stand there, and everything you see, we own. You can have Girls Camp and Boy Scout Camp there at the same time and not have any problems. They can't get to each other. It is huge. And we've become the stewards because of what happened there, and that's the sacrifice of the Martin people.
When pioneers moved to the west with courage strong, they met the test. They pushed their handcarts all day long, and as they pushed, they sang this song. For some must push and some must pull as we go marching up the hill. So merrily on the way we go until we reach the valley. Oh.
I hope that it's beneficial to anyone who will hear it, and that the stories that are told will touch the lives of people the way that they've touched my life and the life of the lives of the members of the River Wyoming Stake. This is Vale Crossing. Shortly after the acquisition of the Sun Ranch was completed, President Gordon B. Hinckley called and asked me if I could direct the stake in building a bridge across the Sweetwater. The bridge that originally was across the Sweetwater was right here on this location. However, it was an old railroad car that had been wrecked. It was bent and had no surface on it other than the steel, and was slippery when wet, and had no railings, and was only 10 feet wide. It was a bit of a fright for many people when they went across the bridge, because it looked like you were going to fall off into the bridge, into the river. However, there was ample room if you were careful in driving across the bridge that you never slipped off into the water. Nonetheless, President Hinckley desired that we construct a new bridge. That was quite an undertaking for the River Wyoming Stake because it's 90 miles one direction to the bridge, and by the time that it was completed, there was over 8,000 man-hours of donated time in the construction of this bridge. The bridge is constructed from 2 railroad cars, the original car that was already here, a flatbed car that had been in a wreck, and one that John Creer from Farm Management purchased. The pilings were driven 4 on each side with a pile driver, and each one is rated to be able to hold 19 tons of weight. And so this bridge can withstand over 80 tons easily, and probably even more than that. The engineers indicate that it could take up to 100 tons of weight on the bridge. When we began to build the bridge, our chief bridge builder, Chuck Starks, wanted to ensure that the bridge was exactly right. He, the day that we set the rail cars, after they had pounded in the pilings and filled them with cement, we had 2 large cranes, one on each side of the Sweetwater. They lifted the original car up over the side of the car that we had placed, the new car, and set it on the far side of the bridge so that the wrecked and damaged portions of the cars on both railroad cars would not show to the public. Brother Starks then had us tape the bridge diagonally from corner to corner to ensure that it was square. When we were doing that, the thought came to my mind, as well as everyone else who was there, is how in the world can we get these wrecked railroad cars square? We were within 3 inches, however, and I thought that was close enough, but Brother Starks insisted that we lift the cars again and reset them. We did that a number of times, I think 4 or 5 times, until we had the bridge within 1/4 of an inch of being perfectly square. That was the beginning of the exactness with which this bridge was built. The brethren who worked on this bridge primarily consisted of those from the Riverton, Wyoming stake, also assisted by a member or 2 from the Casper, Wyoming stake, and some from the Rock Springs stake. The bridge took many hours. It was built in the winter of 1996 and 97, and many times the brethren were out here in the freezing cold with the snow blowing, ice chunks floating down the river, and they were very cold laying on that steel. For sleeping and eating, they slept in what is now the visitor center on concrete floors. It used to be the old bunkhouse, or the old ranch house, and the brethren would sleep there and cook their meals there, and they would sleep in sleeping bags on the floor in the old ranch house. They never once complained about the conditions, the working environment, or the cold. They were just grateful for the opportunity to build a bridge. It seemed like it was taking an extra long amount of time to build the bridge. Brother Starks had set the cars 6 feet apart so that the bridge in overall width would be 26 feet in width, so that 2 cars could pass freely on the bridge. The 6-foot span between the 2 cars had to be fixed so that it also would bear the weight of anything that crossed the bridge. Brother Starks began by first building, he and Brother Fabricius, a tram that went underneath the bridge so that they could work on the bottom part of the bridge and put the girders into the bridge to build the support and strength that the bridge needed. There are 26 cross members in the bridge, and it took about 2 days for 4 men to put each one in. I was wondering why, and I talked to Brother Fabricius one day at church, and he said, the reason is because Chuck is making us put everything back. I said, I don't understand. So I went out to see, and you can look underneath the bridge, and where they had to cut the body of the cars to put in the girders, Brother Starks made them save the little 2x3 pieces of steel, and then once the girder was in, re-weld those little pieces of steel back into the bridge. I asked Brother Starks why in the world we were doing that, because it really added no strength to the bridge, but it was only cosmetic and that no one would ever see it. Brother Starks turned to me and said, we are building this bridge for the Lord at the request of the prophet. This bridge will be perfect in every way as best as we can make it. That is the way the brethren proceeded. That same day I stood on the bridge with Brother Starks and watched the ice flow down the river, large chunks of ice. Each time our bridge builders were out there and they stood and watched that ice flow down. Excuse me. Emotions were pretty close to the surface because, of course, they remembered the boys in the Sweetwater with ice carrying the members of the Martin Handcart Company across the Sweetwater River. That day, as we watched the ice float down the river, Brother Starks, with tears in his eyes, said, President,
We're building this bridge so that no one will ever have to get in that water again. As the bridge progressed, the brethren came to me one day and said, President Lorimer, we want to name the bridge. Each crossing of the Sweetwater River has a name. They're not very creative. There's 8 crossings, so there's the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th, or last crossing of the Sweetwater. I asked them jokingly, I said, well, what do you want to name it? 1.5, because that bridge is between the 1st and the 2nd crossing of the Sweetwater River. They said no, that they wanted to name it in honor of the 4 boys who carried members of the Martin Handcart Company out. I thought about that for a while and went back to them and said, you know, if we put somebody's name on here, we'll forget somebody. They looked at me a little puzzled, and so I explained further. I said, you know, if you put their names on there, what about Captain Martin? What about Captain Willie? What about Levi Savage? What about Brigham Young? What about all those who sacrificed so much that those people could reach the valley? I said, let's don't put anybody's name on it. I, in contradiction of that, came back and said, why don't we call it Stark's Crossing? Because Brother Starks was the man who was in charge of the project from our stake. And Starks in German means strong. Brother Starks would have nothing to do with it. I changed it then to La Starks, because Bishop Larson had also done a lot of work on it, and that would make it French, the Strong Bridge. They both said, please don't put our names on it. We therefore formed a committee to name the bridge. The committee members worked diligently to try to find an appropriate meaning for the bridge, an appropriate name. I told them that I wanted it to be symbolic of the link and the connection between the Riverton, Wyoming stake and the people of today with the handcart pioneers of the Martin and the Willie handcart companies. One day, after extensive research, the committee met. They had names like Celestial, Temple, all kinds of names. One little sister came in a quiet moment, and she said, President Lorimer, the bridge needs to be called Vale Crossing. The minute that she said that, I got goosebumps on my arms, and I knew that she was right. She had read a talk given by President Hinckley during the events of the Second Rescue when he stated, quote, during the events of the Second Rescue, people were allowed to reach across the veil and touch each other from both sides of the veil, close quote. The bridge therefore became known as Vale Crossing, or a connection between us and the pioneers of 1856, or of any pioneer heritage. The bridge then was named. It needed a proper marking. The first thought was that we would just simply put a sign there that said Vale Crossing. But the more we thought about it, we wanted it to be something special. The Riverton, Wyoming stake therefore ordered 2 large stones from St. Cloud, Minnesota granite. They came, they're approximately 6 feet tall each and have a panel. On the panel going to the north, or crossing the bridge the first time, it reads Vale Crossing, and then under that it says Rescue of 1856. On the other side of the bridge it says Vale Crossing, Second Rescue, 1992. So as you cross the bridge going towards Martin's Cove, you're going back in time. You see things exactly the way the pioneers saw them when they went into Martin's Cove, or as all the pioneers saw that valley as they came west. When you cross back across the bridge, you come back into our time, our responsibilities and our challenges. And although they're similar, they're very different. We believed that the naming of the bridge was significant, and it has affected many, many people. The bridge was dedicated that summer by the Riverton, Wyoming Stake Presidency. In addition to that, there are some other stories about the bridge that I think are kind of interesting. Brother Ron Fabricius, as he finished his last welds on the bridge, he had purchased a brand new pair of Handcart coveralls when he first started on the bridge, and when he got there and was finished with the bridge, the coveralls were completely in rags because of all of the slag that had come off of the end of his welding rod. He took the Handcart coveralls off, some of these are kind of hard to talk about, and he walked over to the fire. We had a fire there to stay warm, and he reverently laid his coveralls on the fire. One of the missionaries that was there asked why he had done that, as they observed him standing with his head bowed, reverently watching his coveralls burn up. The response was this: my son Corey, he's on a mission in England, and they have a tradition there that when they complete the first year of their mission, they burn one of their American suits as symbolic of being halfway done. He further stated, I'm a convert to the church, so was never privileged to serve a mission. But in a way, these coveralls are my mission suit, and I now have completed this portion of my mission. People come from all over everywhere and want to see Vail Crossing. Non-members want to know about the Vail. They want to know, is there really life after death? One day when the welders were working on the bridge and finishing the railings, Chuck Starks was on one side of the bridge and Ron Fabricius was on the other. Chuck needed something off of Ron's welding truck, and he said, I wish Ron was here. To his amazement, Ron ran across the bridge and asked what he wanted. Chuck said, how in the world did you hear me? They played around with it for a while and determined that the sound had traveled up the big 6-inch tubes that go across the bridge as a railing and come down where Ron was working on the other side of the bridge. Because of that experience, they did not seal the caps on the bridge. Now, members of the Riverton, Wyoming Stake and thousands of others enjoy the opportunity of talking across the Vail as they whisper through the pipe to one another and talk across the Sweetwater River or across Vail Crossing. There's many, many other things about Vail Crossing, but I think that pretty well sums it up.
They pushed their handcarts all day long, and as they pushed, they sang this song. For some must push and some must pull as we go marching up the hill. So merrily on the way we go until we reach the valley. Oh. For some must push and some must pull as we go marching up the hill. So merrily on the way we go until we reach the valley. Oh.
This is Martin's Cove. The Sun family have always maintained that this was Martin's Cove. Some historians have disputed that, but it's been confirmed through President Hinckley that this really is. Some wonderful things have happened here, including what happened here in 1856, although there was a lot of tragedy here. It's a great testimony to the survival of the Mormon spirit. As the pioneers came up this side of the cove, they came up here for the reason that they wanted to get out of the wind. There was wood here that they could cut for fires. They had different theories. Some of them thought they'd stay here the whole winter. As it turned out, they were here, some journals say 9 days, some say 11, but they were here more than a week. There was over, the Martin Company was 576 people. And then the Hunt and the Hodgett people were about another 500, so there was over 1,000 people in here. And when you look at it, you don't think you could put 1,000 people in here, but we've had several thousand people in here, and it doesn't even make a dent in the area. The problems that the Martin people faced, as we can best tell, when you read the journals, they said that they couldn't pound the tent stakes into the ground. Well, you see this tall grass, and you see how rich and green it is as it goes down the draw. The reason it grows that tall and like that is because there's a spring that comes down and runs through there. And the problem that the Martin people had is when they came in here in the wintertime, on certain days you don't get a lot of direct radiant sun in here because the walls of the cove are pretty tall. So they didn't have that. They were camped on top of a frozen iceberg. This was all frozen. And they could not get away from the cold. There was 56 that died here and were buried someplace in this cove or on the other side of the cove. We've had some wonderful experiences here. For whatever reason, maybe it was because I'd been here as a youngster, I never had as strong of feelings about the Martin sites as I do the Willie sites. And when we came here as a stake presidency and with our high council, we would come and I just didn't feel the same feelings that I did at the Willie sites. And so I wondered, is this the right place? Even though it was tradition in the Sun family, I wondered if we were really where we were supposed to be. I brought the high council once and their wives and our bishops. We also brought a lady by the name of Donna Olson, who we called to be our secretary. She served as our secretary all the years we've been in because of all the letters we get. She has a doctorate, but she also takes shorthand. She's a single sister and has done a wonderful job of, we dictate letters to her and she writes them up for us and answers them. I brought her because she's a direct descendant of John Isaac Wardle, who's a member of the Martin Company. I didn't want to ruin it for her because, like most Martin people, they are very defensive about their ancestry and they're very proud of it, as they should be. And so I didn't want to say, Sister Olson, do you think we're in the right place? I just let her wander around down here in the grass and for about 20 minutes. And after about 20 minutes, I went to her and I said, well, Sister O, what do you think? And she had a whole fistful of papers. And she said, something's wrong. So what do you mean something's wrong? She said, well, here, you read it. And she gave it to me, and it was her great-grandfather, John Isaac Wardle's journal. And the journal said that when the rescuers came into the cove, that he thought they were the meanest people in the whole world because they made them go over a little hill and cut 3 trees for firewood. And he didn't want to do that. Well, she looked around and she said, I don't see any little hills. And there aren't any. But yet this journal said he went over a little hill and cut 3 trees. Well, we were down there in the grass, and my stake clerk's son, who was a deacon, who's now on a mission in Paraguay, said, President Lorimer, what about that little hill right there? So I don't know, let's go look. So we'd never been over there. So we came up over this little hill, and right there, we found the 3 tree stumps. They were cut with an axe and they're cedar. They're of that vintage. We can't prove that they for sure are those 3 trees, but the journal was there and there were the trees. And as you can imagine, Sister Olson lost it. I mean, to realize that her great-grandfather, a member of the Martin Company, had in all likelihood cut those 3 trees down. The tree stumps are still here, and people like to see them. This is one of President Hinckley's favorite places, this and Rock Creek. President Faust's Rocky Ridge. President Hinckley, the day of the dedication of Martin's Cove's monument, which you'll see on the way out that we built in 1992, at that time, this was all under the control of the Sons, and the only way you could get in here was to drive up on top of this sand dune. You can't do it anymore because it'll erode away. But we had my Suburban up there, and we had them tell them some stories. And after the stories, the President wanted to see the tree stumps. So I ran down the hill, because even after all these years, I'm still the youngest member of the stake presidency. I ran down the hill, and I was going to show them the trees. And as I was running down this hill, I heard this voice, and he said, "Mother, you stay up there." And I turned around and looked, and President came shooting right past me, and he beat me down here. And as it turned out, he tore the cartilage in his knee, and he never told anybody about it, but he had surgery on it that December. And we took him over and showed him the 3 tree stumps. In May of 1997, when we dedicated it, he had me take him back up there to see the tree stumps. So when you see him, you'll realize that that's a special place, not just to us, but to the prophet. The story that we tell usually about Martin's Cove, President Faust says he thinks it's the greatest love story of the church. What happened here was a lot of suffering and a lot of sadness, but there was also some pretty neat things that happened here. When the first Church News article came out, we began to get lots of letters. My counselor, President McKinnon, came to presidency meeting one Sunday, and he said, "I got a call from a lady from Rexburg, Idaho, and she wants us to find her great-grandfather. No, she wants us to find the man who was engaged to her great-grandmother." And I said, "Well, President, that's real simple. Just tell her it's her great-grandfather." And he said, "No, it's not that easy." He said, "She was engaged to him, and they wanted to wait to get to Salt Lake to get married, but he died in Martin's Cove, and the family doesn't know who he is." I said, "Well, if they don't know who he is, how can we ever figure it out?" He said, "I don't know, but we're going to find him." So my counselors went about trying to find him, and they thought if they were engaged, they probably got on the ship together. Well, they got the ship's log out. Sarah Ann Franks was her name. She got on the ship with a family of 5 children. She was acting kind of as a nanny to them. And there was no eligible bachelors anywhere around where she got on the ship. So I said, "Well, that didn't work. Now let's move on to something else." And they said, "No, we're going to find this guy." They said, "Well, we're going to go and we're going to search the companies and see if we can find any eligible bachelors about her age." Well, they found like 19 of them. And I said, "Well, now what are you going to do?" They said, "Well, we're going to see if any of these 19 bachelors are from her hometown." So they did that, and 5 of them, I think, were. And they said, "Well, now we're going to take these 5 and see if any of them died in Martin's Cove." And 3 of them did. And this was taking a lot of time. We were building monuments, doing temple work, and all this stuff. And my counselors are fooling around, trying to find this guy that nobody knows who he is. And I said, "Why don't you guys just pick one and send it to him?" And President Kitchen said, "No way, we're not doing that." I said, "Well, the family doesn't know. We can't figure it out. Just send them all 3 names and say it's one of these 3 and let them pick one." And they said, "Nope, we're going to find him." Well, a few weeks later, I got a letter from, of all places, Johannesburg, South Africa. And in the letter was 4 pages of a handwritten journal. And in the journal on page 3, there's one sentence. All it says is Sarah Ann Franks is betrothed to George Padley. We had the guy's name. It was about 10 o'clock. I called both my counselors and said, "What were those 3 guys' names? I know who it is." And they said, "We can't remember." So we met up at the stake center, and sure enough, George Padley was one of the 3 that we had identified. Then we could put the whole story together for the family from journals. What happened is George Padley was a young man. He risked his life over on the North Platte at the last crossing of the Platte down by Casper, and spent a lot of time in the water helping the pioneers across the river. It's not the famous crossing we all read about, but nonetheless it had the same effect. George Padley never ever recovered. He got this far and died. Sarah Ann Franks so loved George Padley that she didn't want the wolves to eat him. So she took off one of the only things she had to stay warm. It was her shawl. She had the brethren roll his body into the shawl and had it hung in one of these trees on the other side over here so that the wolves wouldn't get him. She asked the brethren when they came back the next summer to give George Padley a proper burial. By that time his body had decayed and fallen out of the shawl, and all that was left in the tree was the shawl. And the last thing that Sarah Ann Franks saw when she left here was George Padley's body in that tree. When we were up on the hill with President Faust, my counselor told him that story. President Faust became very, very emotional. And he said, "President Lorimer, did you seal Sarah Ann Franks to George Padley?" I said, "No, sir, we didn't. We couldn't. Because she was taken into the Thomas Mackey home. And in the Thomas Mackey home, she eventually married Brother Mackey as a third plural wife. She had children. I've met many of the descendants of Sarah Ann Franks. They're wonderful, wonderful people." I said, "President, we couldn't seal her to George Padley because she'd already been sealed. And at that time, a woman could only be sealed to one man." The President stood up here on this hill and sorry, these people are pretty close to us. He had tears in his eyes and he said, "President Lorimer, you go back to the temple and you seal Sarah Ann Franks to George Padley." He said, "You give her a choice. The only reason they weren't sealed is because George Padley gave his life so that others might live." Knowing Sarah Ann Franks like we do, we know that she was happy with Thomas Mackey, but her true love was George Padley. There's no question in my mind that George Padley wants her as his eternal companion, and that she wants her own husband, not a plural husband. Sarah Ann Franks is now sealed to George Padley. And I don't know how that'll all sort out, but I'm glad President Faust made the exception and allowed us to do that. That was a great day in the temple. It was a spiritual feast to do that. It could only be done with the authorization of a member of the Quorum of the 12 or First Presidency. And now the policy of the church is that you can do that. We've often wondered if Sarah Ann Franks had anything to do with that. I don't know if she did or not, but the fact is it has been changed since that happened. There's many other stories that we could tell you about the Cove, but I know we need to move on. But let me just tell you one modern day story that happened over here. After President Hinckley came down and looked at the stumps, we went over on that side of the Cove. We had always in our minds thought that this is probably where they camped and that that's probably where they took the dead, but we didn't know. President Hinckley, when he was over on that side of the Cove, and you'll see a big dead tree laying there. The four of us were standing there, my two counselors and I and President Hinckley, along with Brother Sayre. President Hinckley stood there and all of a sudden just took his hat off and knelt down and said, "Brethren, we are on sacred ground. This is where they brought the dead." that to us was confirmation enough that this is the right place. This is Martin's Cove. There's no plaque there. There's no intended to be any plaque there that says that that's what happened. I was there, and I bear testimony that a prophet of God knelt down there and said what he said. I was privileged to be there. It was like being with Moses. You didn't even want to breathe. You know, I don't know if you've had the privilege of being with those brethren, but there's times where they're a public figure that's giving a talk or dedicating something, and there's other times that they're prophets, and they're different. That day, standing there with him, I realized I was standing with Moses, Nephi, Abraham, and that some wonderful things were happening. Shortly after that is when he asked us to try to buy this or to get the easement. He always believed that this would happen. We're glad that it has. It's affected so many that have come here. In the early morning, even right now, if you're just quiet, there's a real peaceful feeling here. The suffering, the sadness, the hunger, the memory is still here. But more important, the memory of absolute devotion to the gospel is here. And I think it behooves all of us to kind of soak that in when we're in places like this, because they are special. They're sanctified by the sacrifices that were made here. And we're just glad you're all here. And I don't know if you have any questions about any of this. We'd be glad to answer them. We haven't found any artifacts here. We've looked a little, but not very much. There was one found over on the other side that we gave to Sister Hinckley with the approval of the BLM. And there's one other one that I told some of you about that's down on our land that we found, an ox yoke pin. I think if you came in here with a metal detector, you'd probably find a lot of things. But they've just kind of left it the way it is. So that's Martin's Cove.
For some must push and some must pull as we go marching up the hill. So merrily on the way we go until we reach the valley. Oh.
This is the bronze that I told you about last night, and on the back side of this it has a crack from this corner to that corner. And it's cast in bronze. And that's the first one we got. This monument is the one that weighs 12 tons. And this is one of our favorite places because of what happened here. The historians debate where exactly the Willie people were rescued. And after having read the thousands of pages that we have, we tell them we're not sure where they were rescued. The journals are all reminiscent, and they have them at different places. Some historians place them clear back at Icy Slough, some at Sweetwater Station, which is the sixth crossing of the Sweetwater, some at St. Mary's Station, which is 2 miles from here, and others down here in the Willows, right down there. And what we tell them is we're not sure where they were, but what happened here was a very unique thing. This is the only big hill from here clear back to Ice Slough. And the journals all say that they saw their faithful captain coming down a large eminence and that he was well ahead of the wagons. We always wondered why in the world was Captain Willie not in a wagon. You know, he left the company and then the company moved while he was gone, and him and Joseph Elder got in on a mule and rode it all the way to Rock Creek, got the rescuers up in the middle of the night and brought them back to the Willie Company. And our question was, why wasn't he in a wagon? Because if you'd been out in the elements and hadn't slept for 3 days, or 2.5 days, and been that cold, you probably would want to be in the wagon. But he wasn't. He was on the mule well ahead of the wagons. And as he came down the hill, the journals say cries of joy rent the air, and brave men wept, and the women cried, and President Hinckley, when he was here at the dedication, he talked about that in his mind's eye, he didn't say that this was for sure the place, but he said in his mind's eye, he could see Captain Willie going down the trail. That is the Mormon Trail right there. And that down there in the willows, that road is the Mormon Trail. That he could, that they greeted their, the benighted people, and that they danced on frozen limbs. I think that's a great description. Danced on frozen limbs. Anyway, the Willie Company had an additional problem that the Martin Company didn't. And that is that they were both Danish and English, and there were some Swedes mixed in, whereas the Martin Company was primarily English. Well, when Captain Willie, we always wondered why was he ahead of the wagons when they got down there. And we found out why from all of these journals that we've read. And what happened, I think, was one of the most Christ-like things that's ever happened. You know, if you put yourself in the position of the Willie people, they had slaughtered their last cattle, their children were crying because they were cold, their fingers were freezing, they didn't have anything to eat. Maybe your husband or your wife had just died, or one of your kids. You didn't know what was going to happen tomorrow. You knew that you were going to go over Rocky Ridge the next day, which was the highest point in the Mormon Trail, and that it was going to take you a long time to get to Rock Creek. You didn't know it was going to take 27 hours, non-stop march to get there, but you knew it was going to be a big ordeal. Well, what happened was, in English, Captain Willie went down there and explained to the English and the Danes. He said, in those wagons behind me, some journals say there was 18 and some say 16, but he said, in the wagons behind me are everything we need to sustain life. There's food, there's fuel, and there's clothing. Somewhere behind us is the Martin Company. We don't know if they stopped at Fort Casper. We don't know if they stopped at Fort Laramie. We don't know but what they're all dead. But they need these supplies as bad as we do. And it's my recommendation as your captain that we send them all on but two. And he called for a vote. And even though they didn't understand all the English, they knew exactly what he was saying. Send the food on to others. Sacrifice ourselves that others might live. Now today, if that happened, there would probably have been a riot down there, and Captain Willie would be buried down there. But that's not what happened that day. 500 hands went up in the air and sustained that decision. And they let all the wagons but two go on to the Martin people. They didn't even stop them to look what was in them. They just said, go on to the Martin people.
President Lorimer speaks of all but two wagons of the supplies having been sent on by the Willie people. He notes, however, that the journal records are not totally clear on this point. Some journals record that as many as 6 of the wagons may have remained with the Willie people. The majority, however, were sent on to the Martin people. As President Lorimer notes, that sacrificial decision by the Willie people makes this site here in the Willows especially touching.
I don't know exactly where all that happened, but I know this: if you go down in those willows, there's a feeling that I've never felt before of love for mankind. And the Willie people, wherever that happened, I believe it was there because of the feelings that exist down in those willows. An unbelievable service to the Martin people. If they wouldn't have done that, all of the Martin people would have died, without question. The next morning, the Willie Company got up at 6 a.m. and began the ascent of Rocky Ridge. They came up right up that road. That doesn't look like much of a hill, but I've pulled handcarts up that hill in July. Last year, or 2 years ago, we had a handcart trek, and the stake presidency was asked to pull a handcart by ourselves. And We got to here, and President McKinnon passed out right over there. I mean, he went down. That is quite a hill when you come up with a handcart. I don't know how they did it in the blizzard. I really don't. They came up the hill, and this is where James Kirkwood carried his brother. I didn't tell you that story last night, but James Kirkwood was 11 years old. He was traveling with his 3 brothers and his mother. His father had died in Scotland. And James and his brothers, George and Joseph and Robert, were down there with their mother, and George was a cripple of polio, so they had to pull him in the handcart. Joseph's feet were frozen. Joseph was 4, and he couldn't walk. But they also knew they couldn't pull both of them in the handcart because Robert was 21. So that left Robert and his mother pulling the handcart, George in the handcart, and the captains told the Kirkwood family that they would either have to stay down there in those willows and wait for more wagons because Joseph couldn't walk, or someone would have to carry him. James Kirkwood, age 11, the second name that we looked up when we started all this, carried his little brother all the way from those willows to Rock Creek. It's only 12 miles, but it took him 27 hours in that blizzard of October of 1856. When he got there, James Kirkwood sat his little brother down and laid down and died. Bodil Mortensen, that's where she started, is right down there, shepherding 5 little children, Niels Nielsen and others. She was only 9. She got them all there. Then she went out to gather firewood, and they found her frozen, leaning up against the wheel of a handcart with her arms full of sagebrush. Unusual people. Really, really unusual people. That's the Willie Rescue Site. Some people call it what we've called it, the Willie Rescue Site. Other people call it the Eminence. We like to believe that this is where it happened. There's no question that the Willie Company camped down there and then made their ascent from Rocky Ridge from there. From there, it goes up 700 feet to the top of Rocky Ridge in 2 miles. It's a son of a gun. And where we're going, you'll see what it is. I don't know if you'll be like I am, but I am amazed that anybody made it. It's mean, nasty country. And in the winter, it's worse. As we go along, there's one section, if you look off to the left, you'll see real deep ruts from the wagons and the handcarts as they went up the hill. And in some places, they're 2 or 3 wide from where they would have to move over because of the mud. And they're still there today. They're just the way they were.
Please fast forward the tape now to the end of Side A, then turn it over to Side B. President Lorimer will continue with the stories of Rocky Ridge and Rock Creek Hollow.
For some must push and some must pull as we go marching up the hill. So merrily on the way we go until we reach the valley. Oh.
This is Rocky Ridge. This is the first spine of Rocky Ridge. There's 2 spines of Rocky Ridge. This one, and then the one over there. The handcarts and the wagons, everything that went west, other than the very few parties that stayed on the south side of the Sweetwater, came over Rocky Ridge. This is, according to some historians, the highest point in the Mormon Trail. Others say it's Big Mountain, but they didn't go across the top of Big Mountain. But Big Mountain is higher than Rocky Ridge. It's 200 feet in extent. It goes up 200 feet from those willows to here. It was just 2 miles that we just traveled to here. The Willie Company made this march from here and then 10 miles further to Rock Creek. Took them 27 hours. We felt like there should be a monument here to commemorate Rocky Ridge as well as those who struggled so much to get over it. William James whoever, William James. He struggled a lot right here. He had a shotgun from Scotland, and it was his prized possession, and he sat down and said, I can't go any further, and he gave some, Levi Savage, I think it was, his shotgun and said, give it to somebody else. And Levi Savage encouraged him to come on, and he made it as far as Rock Creek, but that's as far as he made it. This place is President Faust's favorite place, if you can believe that. He loves it up here. There's something about Rocky Ridge and President Faust. Those rocks right over there are where he was sitting when he was filmed for Conference. And there was a great story about what happened that day, and let me just tell it to you, because that day the second rescue finally all came together for me. What happened was President Faust called me in the spring of 1990, either 6 or 7, anyway, and said that the first presidency was going to make a movie that was going to be showed at halftime in Conference. That's what we call in between the sessions. And he said that President Hinckley was going to be at winter quarters, or Nauvoo, President Monson at winter quarters, and he wanted to be filmed at Rocky Ridge. So he said, would you take me up there again? And I said, oh heavens, yeah, we'll take you up there. So whenever one of the first presidency come, there's lots of plans and lots of schedules and lots of things, and you never really know what's going to happen until it happens. And that day, that week, he called just before he was supposed to come, and he said, I can't come in an airplane anymore, and I can't drive because I don't have enough time, so I'm going to come in a helicopter. And I said, no kidding. He said, yeah. He said, would you get the film crew set up on Rocky Ridge the day before, and then I'll come the next day, but please come to Rocky Ridge because I want to see you. So I said, sure, President, I'll be there. So we got the film crew up here. It looked like a little city up here. There was TV vans and generators and computers and those big silver screen things that reflect the light and all this stuff all over everywhere up here. And I came up the next day, and I was just driving along in the Suburban on that dirt road where we came in, and I saw a helicopter fly off to the south. And I'm always late for everything, but that day I wasn't. I looked at my watch to make sure, and I wasn't late. So I just kept driving, and you know, as I told you last night, I've been doing this for a while, and my family has never begrudged a minute of it, even though all of my children can never remember when I wasn't in the stake presidency. They've never ever complained, and my wife has only complained once. And that was when my son turned off the lights on the high councilman when he was talking in church. And then he turned them off again, and the high councilman said, well, President Lorimer's son thinks it's time to go home, so I guess we'll just quit here. And all she said was, why can't you come to church sometimes with us? And that's all she's ever done. And we've never begrudged a minute of it. To the contrary. It's been a great blessing to our family to be allowed to serve, and to serve so long. But sometimes I really miss my family. And that day, I was really missing my wife. She's my very best friend. And as I was driving along and saw the helicopter fly by, I called her on the cell phone just to tell her that I missed her. And I kept going down the road, and all of a sudden, this helicopter flew right over the top of the Suburban, just, and it went down the road about 120 yards, maybe 200 yards, and spun around in the road and was just hovering there. And sitting in the front seat was the pilot, Dr. Goebel, and President James E. Faust. It was the wildest thing you've ever seen. And they landed off to the left side of the road, and President Faust opened the door and motioned me over, so I drove up there. and I stuck out my hand and said, "Welcome to Wyoming again." And he said, "President, could you take us to Rocky Ridge?" And I said, "Sure, it's right there." And he said, "Well, could you take us?" And I said, "Sure." So I went to get in the back of the helicopter, because we have one just like it. And he said, "No, no, no." He says, "Don't get in the helicopter." He said, "You just drive and we'll follow you." So I started driving my Suburban down that dirt road, and this helicopter was right behind us like this. And I'm not exaggerating. I could look in the rearview mirror of my Suburban and see the skids of that chopper right there. And if people would have saw us, they'd have thought we were making a movie or something. It was bizarre. Anyway, we got close to the Willie Rescue Site Monument, and the helicopter flew off this way. And I thought, well, President knows where he's at now, and they'll go on up there. So I stopped at the Willie Rescue Site Monument because that's one of my favorite places. Just kind of remembered the good old days of building the monuments and our people and the work and the Willie people. And then I got back in the Suburban and drove up here. Well, when I got over there, where the road comes over the hill, there was all this massive TV cameras and things over here. And I just assumed that they were videoing President Faust. And so I stopped over there because I didn't want the engine to be recorded on the TV stuff. And I sat over there for a while, and all of a sudden, about 15 people ran down this road and ran up there to where I was parked. And Bill Schaefermeyer of the audio video department of the church started knocking on the window. So I rolled it down, and he said, "Where is he?" I said, "Where is who?" He said, "Where's President Faust?" I said, "He's with you guys." He said, "No, he's not." He said, "He was with you." And I said, "Yeah, but that was way back down the road." He said, "No, you stopped right there, and the helicopter was right above you." I said, "It wasn't either." He said, "Yes, it was." And he said, "If you'd have turned down your music in your Suburban, you could have heard them." And I said, "No, really, they left me way down there and came up here." And he said, "No," and all the film crew said, "Nope, they were right there and the helicopter was right above you." I said, "Man, I don't know where he went." I said, "Maybe," and I couldn't tell them what we were doing, but we were just about ready to finalize the ranch deal. And I thought maybe President had gone over to Martin's Cove because we were a little early. And I said, "Well, he went over to Martin's Cove to check that out maybe." And so that lasted for about half an hour. And I was up here with the film crew, and they were all getting worried because President hadn't come. And they were starting to say things like, "Well, maybe they crashed." And I said, "They didn't crash." And they said, "How do you know that?" And I said, "The Willie people won't let that happen. He's okay and everything's going to work out fine." Well, he didn't come for an hour. And finally, a young man who looked like he just barely got home off a mission jumped on a four-wheeler right over there. And he said, "I'm going to go find him." And he revved that thing up. And I grabbed him by the arm just as he was starting to leave. And I said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa." I said, "Have you ever been to Wyoming before?" And he said, "No, why do you ask?" And I said, "If that chopper's down somewhere, the only way you'll ever find it is from the air." I said, "But it's not down." And he says, "Well, if it's down and on fire, I'll see smoke." And I said, "Well, you're on the highest point anywhere around here. Do you see any smoke?" He says, "Nope, but I'm going to go find him." So he went roaring down this hill on that four-wheeler and started up that way. And he got right to the crest of that hill. And it was the funniest thing you've ever seen. Because the chopper came right over the top of that hill and almost hit that kid. He bailed off that four-wheeler and it went down the drain over there. And when President Faust flew over right here, his eyes were about this big. Like, wow, what's going on? And as they flew by, they landed up here between the two spines of Rocky Ridge. And I just stayed down here to the monument because I wanted to stay out of the way. And I saw that there was somebody in the back seat of the helicopter. And I thought, well, that's neat. He went to Casper and got one of his grandkids. And then I thought, no, he got somebody at the ranch and brought them up here. I thought, well, that's really cool. And then something happened that changed my life. and made me a different man. The helicopter landed, and the first thing that came over Rocky Ridge right here, standing on those rocks, was President James E. Faust. And he's a tall man anyway, but standing up that high above us, he was really tall. He didn't have his suit coat on. He had a white shirt and a tie. The pilot was carrying his coat, and he came over and stood up on those rocks and threw his arms up in the air like this and started screaming. And he was screaming, what he screamed was, he said, "Scott, look what I have for you." I thought there must be another Scott, but he was looking right at me. And he said it twice. The next thing that came over Rocky Ridge was my wife. He'd flown to Riverton and got her. He didn't know I was missing her that day. He'd become disoriented and needed somebody to bring him up here. He and the pilot both say that from there they couldn't see this. It wasn't circumstance, it was for me. I finally understood what the Willie people wanted. When he brought her over the hill, the thought came into my mind, someday, when I cross the veil for real, I'm going to meet a prophet. And it's not going to be James E. Faust. It's going to be Joseph Smith. Because he is the president of this dispensation. I hope he says to me, "Scott, look what I have for you," and that it's my family. I hope he doesn't say, "You didn't make it. You can't come with your family." A prophet of God brought me my wife to Rocky Ridge. I will never forget that. People ask the question, why were the Willie people out here? What in the world did they think they were doing? Why did Brigham Young allow these people to suffer? Well, that's why. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't a failure. To the contrary, it was a magnificent success. Those people were here because somebody came and knocked on their door and told them that on the head of a boy prophet had been restored the fullness of the gospel, including the sealing keys, and that they could be together forever as families in the presence of God. That's why they were here. They weren't here because they couldn't make a living in Denmark and England. They weren't here because of religious persecution. They weren't here to get new land. They were here to be sealed. That's why they came to our stake and pled with us to go do their temple work. That day, as I saw my wife with a prophet, I covenanted that I would live my life so that I would always be worthy of her, and that I would hopefully be able to be with her throughout all eternity, because that's all I have, is my wife and my children. I hope as you're here that you'll feel those same feelings of the Willie people. That's all they wanted. They didn't want anything else. They could make livings. They'd done so for hundreds of years. They wanted the sealing keys of the temple and were willing to give their lives so that some of them could have them. I think sometimes we take that for granted. We have temples at our disposal. We need to teach our children the importance of what it is the prophet Joseph restored. I bear you my testimony that those things are true. I've been blessed to have some wonderful, wonderful experiences, but none of them were as special and sacred to me as the day I saw my wife brought to me by a prophet. And I hope one day that I can shake Joseph Smith's hand and tell him thank you for what he's given me through his suffering and his sacrifice. And
for some must push and some must pull as we go marching up the hill. So merrily on the way we go until we reach the valley. Oh.
this is where the Willie Company stopped in October of 1856 after they came over Rocky Ridge. They spent 2 days here from absolute exhaustion. This is where Bodil Mortensen, the little Danish girl, is buried, and where James Kirkwood is buried. There's some other famous stories, and we'll just tell you a couple. Archibald McPhail, I don't know, somebody asked me, somebody said they were related to Jane McKinnon. Archibald McPhail was in charge of a tent of older sisters, and he got them all here and put up the tent down here, and when he looked in the tent, he realized that one sister was missing. So in the middle of the night, I mean, they got here in the wee hours of the morning, he walked clear back to Strawberry Creek to find her. And she was sitting on the other side of Strawberry Creek, and she said she would not cross the creek because she didn't want to fall through the ice and get cold. And Brother McPhail tried to get her to come across the creek, but she wouldn't. So finally he went across the creek on the ice and picked her up and started back across Strawberry Creek, and the ice broke and he fell through the ice and sank about chest deep into the water. They walked then, the two of them, back here at 6 miles, and of course his clothes were frozen to him and it was a mess. And they got here and he put her in the tent. I mean, this is September and you can feel how cold it is. Imagine what it's like when there's a blizzard up here. We're 2,000 feet higher than we were at Martin's Cove, and that's why it's so much colder here. When Archibald McPhail got here, he got the little sister in the tent, and then he didn't have any place to stay because other people had gotten in the tent because they didn't put up all the tents because it was so cold. So all he had to keep out of the weather was a handcart. He tipped a handcart over and then crawled underneath it and put it against the wind, and he slept underneath that handcart. The next morning they found Archibald McPhail. He was still alive, but he was frozen to the ground. And so they did the only thing they could do is they cut him away from the ground with knives and axes. And they just tried to cut his clothes, but of course they took a lot of flesh with it. And Archibald McPhail lived until he got to Evanston, and he's buried down there on the Bear River. This is an area where there was a lot of suffering. There's other stories of common graves. There's a common grave of the Willie people of 9. There's another common grave of 9 amongst the Martin people. This is the only grave of 13. Because it was the only grave with 13 in it, it was of interest to the church to re-find this grave. George Albert Smith came here in 1932 and tried with a group of people from Lyman and Evanston and also the historian's office to exactly locate where the grave was. They were frustrated because they weren't able to do it. So finally President Smith called them all together. He was a member of the Quorum of the 12 at the time, and said that he wanted to have a prayer after 2 days of being here and not finding it, and maybe the Lord would help them find the grave. They knelt down here where the grave is, and Bishop Rollins from Evanston came to join the group, and he tripped. He stepped over a piece of sagebrush and tripped and actually kind of hurt himself. And they looked in the sagebrush to see what he had tripped on, and there was the rim of a handcart wheel, the iron rim, buried in that sagebrush. They knelt down right down here, and President Smith received the inspiration that that's where the grave is. When we get down there, I'll show you some things about it that have confirmed that. The monument was built by the Lyman stake, It was originally just a big boulder, and they put the plaque on it, and then they built the monument, and you'll see that this monument was the model that was used to build all the rest of the monuments. Our stake, as I said, began coming here in 1976, and we just fell in love with it. It's a special place to us. There's been some wonderful things happen here. The brethren have a special feel for this place because of what happened here. Rock Creek is much older than 1856 with the pioneers, and there's some things that happened here that are very sacred and very special that the brethren don't talk about and that we don't talk about, but it's a special place. If you come down here, we'll show you the grave. This area right here is where the Willie Company camped. And I need to tell you about a little bit more. When Captain Willie came over Rocky Ridge to find the rescuers because his company was out of food, him and Joseph Elder came right down this road. And Harvey Clough and the rescuers had gone down into the willows. And they had, the journals say that they were at Willow Creek, some of them, and some of them say they were at Rock Creek. If you look at the old maps of the state of Wyoming, Willow Creek, which is one drainage over, and Rock Creek are both called Willow Creek. They thought they had the same origin, but they don't. It was not until about 1865 that this was actually named Rock Creek. It was named Willow Creek before that. This is where the rescuers were. They were down in the willows. Harvey Clough at about 2 o'clock in the morning had a dream, and his dream was that somebody from the Willie Company was coming. And if they didn't put a sign up or something, they would go right past them down the trail. So, because the trail, it also goes up there, right past that little building, it goes up, and this branch of the trail and that branch of the trail meet on the other side of that, and that's where Captain Willie would have gone. So Harvey Clough came down and he put a sign right here in this road that said, "We're down in the willows." About 20 minutes after Harvey Clough put the sign in the road, Captain Willie and Joseph Elder came into camp and got him up and said, we've got to go right now. So the rescuers left here early in the morning to go get the Willie people. We've also wondered, why in the world did the Willie people come clear to here? Why did they work 27 hours to get here? Because they could have stopped at Radium Springs. There was water there. There's also aspen groves along the way that they could have stopped in. We believe that the rescuers left a stash of goods down here, of food, to lighten the wagon so that they could go faster to get to the Willie people. There was another interesting thing that happened here. A young man was down here sleeping. He was one of the rescuers, and he had a dream. So the next morning, as they're driving in the dark going over to the Willie people at the Willie rescue site, he tells William Kimball, he said, you never believe what happened. And Brother Kimball said, no, what? He said, last night I had a dream. And Brother Kimball said, yeah, I know, we're in Wyoming. It was a nightmare. We're in a blizzard. He said, no, really. He said, I had this dream, and I'm going to meet my future wife amongst the Willie people. And Brother Kimball said, you have got to be kidding. I mean, how are you going to know who she is? And he said, well, I saw her. And unbeknownst to anybody, there was a lady in the Willie Company by the name of Lucy Ward. She came across the ocean in 1855. She only had enough money to make it to New York City. And so she couldn't come to Salt Lake that year. She came the next year with the Willie Company after she'd earned enough money. She worked in New York City as a hatter. She made women's hats. And part of her pay was that they would let her keep fabric, pieces of material that she didn't use in making the hats. And one of the pieces that she kept was a green veil. So this guy, as he's telling Brother Kimball, he said, this girl, she has this big floppy hat on, and it's tied on with this green thing. And he said, that's how I'm going to know who she is. So they come down that big hill over there where we were yesterday, and Brother Kimball sees Lucy Ward running around with his hat on, tied on with his green veil. And he says, there's your dream girl. So the guy, he jumps off the wagon and he runs over to her, and he says, you'll never believe this, but last night I had a dream about you, and you're supposed to be my wife. And she said, "You get away from me. I don't want nothing to do with you. All I want's what's in those wagons." And he said, "No, really, you're really supposed to marry me. I saw you, you had the green veil, ask him, I told him about it." And she didn't have nothing to do with him. And he worked on her all the way to Fort Bridger. And at Fort Bridger, they were married. And they raised a large family, and the family still has the green veil that was here at Rock Creek. Okay, this sagebrush right back here is where the man tripped, and they built the monument right there. This little granite marker on the other side is the one that I told you about that Paul Willie gave us that had the name of the 13, and that's what we used to start the second rescue to find the names. There's two thoughts as to where the grave really is. We're fairly certain that it's within this perimeter that we've put up, and we put it up because people unknowingly were just running all over everywhere. And one of the thoughts is, when you read the description of the grave, it's different in each account. Some of them say they piled them up and that it was in a square grave. Others say that it was a circular grave with their feet on the inside. Others say that it was in the shape of a square. And we don't really know. We know that George Albert Smith said it's right here. We know, of course, that the remains of them are no longer here, although I'll tell you a couple things that we found. Some people believe that they're directly underneath this monument. I don't know if they are or not, but there's these trenches right here. You'll see right here there's a trench here, and it goes down that way, and then it goes that way. If you take these people and estimate it on their age and their sex and lay them end to end, they fit perfect in those trenches. It makes sense in some ways that if the ground was frozen and they were that cold and they were digging a grave and they didn't know how many were dead, that they would dig and it would be a lot easier to just keep digging straight, and that they would lay them in trenches until they hit a rock or something, and then they might turn the corner. We found, when one of our Eagle Scouts was putting up this railing around here, over on the second post from the corner down there, when they were drilling that hole, which got kind of close to that trench, about 1.5 feet down, 2 feet down, they found the heel of a boot. And they also found some bones that were human. So we just put them back in the hole and moved the hole out a little further. But this is where it is. This is where the brethren have been they just keep coming here. This is where President Hinckley knelt down and gave Bodil some flowers and said that she was his friend too. President Faust comes here whenever he's in the area. He likes to come here. This is a very special place to our stake and to the Willie people. We don't have a temple in Wyoming, but this is our favorite place, is Rock Creek. But this rock was placed here by our stake at the same time that the two were placed over at Vail Crossing. We as a stake presidency, you've been to all the sites now that we've been involved with, and you've seen our stake center and everything, and you've noticed probably that there's nobody's names on anything, and we really wanted to keep it that way because it's not about any one person or any group of people, and nobody owns it. It's a spiritual thing. And so we were very careful to never put names on anything. The only names that show up are names of the First Presidency. There's these three on here. Then on the plaque on the Riverton Stake Center, the name of Gordon B. Hinckley appears. But as a stake presidency, after we put the monuments at the bridge at Vail Crossing, at the same time we said, you know, there's been so much happen, and there's been so many promises made to us. President Hinckley, when he was here in 1992, he gave our stake a blessing, an apostolic blessing, and he told us that if we would remember and if we would teach our children that the blessing that he gave us, and the blessing is that we would never in our lifetimes be without food, shelter, or enough to financially support ourselves because of what we had done. He said, if you will teach your children, that promise is good for 5 generations. So we said, you know, there's nothing to remind us to teach our children. And like the stones over at the bridge, you know, when people say, what mean ye by these stones? We wanted a stone that our grandchildren would ask us, you know, what does this mean? And then we would have to tell them the blessings as theirs. President Faust gave us 2 apostolic blessings in 1992, and President Monson gave us one in 1997. And those blessings are pretty profound, and they're sacred to us. The first time it happened, we'd heard that those things happen sometimes, but like I told you, we'd never had an apostle in central Wyoming, ever, in any of our lifetimes, and we certainly had never had the president of the church ever. And so when those things happened, it took us quite by surprise, and it was a very humbling thing. President Faust used the scripture, Helaman 10:4 and 5, in his blessing to us, and that's why we put it up there. We put this rock here so that our grandchildren would ask us. But as I have people here like you, people ask me, you know, and people have moved into our stake since these things have happened. And they kind of say, well, you know, it's not our fault we weren't here. You know, you know, can we join the club? And I tell them the same thing I tell you. This doesn't belong to us. It doesn't belong to anybody. Because you've been here, you're part of it. And although you weren't there when all those things happened, you felt things at these places that'll affect you the rest of your lives. And you, like us, have the responsibility to teach our grandchildren, our children, our great-grandchildren about the history of the Martin and the Willie people. There is no better example of devotion to the gospel. When I think of Captain Willie, you know, you're here, and it's a little cold, but you haven't ridden a horse for 30 hours in a blizzard. Your families are all safe. His was in Mendon, Utah. He didn't want to be the captain of a handcart company. He had a horse waiting for him in New York City. He was returning off of his mission. He wanted to go home. He wanted to be with his wife and his children. But they asked him to be the captain of a handcart company. So he sold his horse, and he bought 3 handcarts, and he gave them to some people that couldn't afford to buy them. He rode a horse for 30 hours and came here in search of somebody that could help him. He never went to sleep. He rode 30 hours back and brought the supplies to those people, and then said, I think we need to send them on to the Martin people. They weren't normal people. They're the kind of people we need to be, all of us. Willing to teach and sacrifice and to share the gospel with others so that we all one day might receive the eternal blessings that Father in heaven wants for all of us. And so we're glad that you came. We're glad you're at Rock Creek. This is our home. President Hinckley asked me once, he said, which stake is the hardest to run? And I said, what do you mean, which stake's the hardest to run? He says, well, you have 2. I said, no, I just have the Riverton, Wyoming stake. And he said, no, you got that one, plus you got the Willie Martin stake. And I said, well, I never thought of it that way, but the Willie Martin stake's the toughest one to run. And he said, why? And I said, because those people bother me while I'm asleep. You know, the living people at least quit calling around 11 o'clock. But the Willie Martin people have never stopped calling me. I like to come up here in the winter. It's hard to get in here. Don't ever come up here without telling us, because we don't want any more graves up here. But we come in on horseback and we come in on snowmobiles, and it's so snowy, so white, and it's almost blue. And you can almost see them in their tents as they suffered here, and as they died, and they willingly gave for each other. And most of them made it. The handcart experience was not a failure. It was a great success. It left us a burning legacy of devotion to the gospel, and I'm glad we've been part of it.
When pioneers moved to the west with courage strong, they met the test. They pushed their handcarts all day long, and as they pushed, they sang this song. For some must push and some must pull as we go marching up the hill. So merrily on the way we go until we reach the valley, oh.